Why high-value women walk away without explaining. There exists within the feminine psyche a cathedral built not of stone and mortar, but of silence and shadow, a sacred architecture that has been under construction for millennia, each woman adding her own invisible stones to its ever-rising spires. Here, in this hallowed space of the inner self, she has learned to read scripture written in the language that predates all human tongues, the language of knowing without needing to know why. The high-value woman, and let us understand that this designation speaks not of worth measured in the marketplace of ego, but of a soul that has recognized its own inherent completeness, carries within her chest a library of truths that need no external validation to exist, like the ancient Alexandrian texts that survived the burning because they were memorized by mystics who understood that the most precious wisdom lives in the spaces between thoughts. Her knowing exists in the realm beyond justification. Watch her as she moves through the world, and you will witness something that confounds the modern mind, a being who can make decisions without the endless committee meetings of explanation that have become the hallmark of our uncertain age. She does not walk through life trailing behind her a parade of reasons, justifications, and elaborate defenses for why she chooses what she chooses. Instead, she moves like water flowing downhill, not because it has reasoned out the path of least resistance, but because it knows in its essential nature where it belongs. This is the paradox that Jung himself wrestled with in his exploration of the feminine principle, how the anima, the soul image, operates from a place of intuitive knowing that threatens the ego's desperate need to categorize, explain, and control. The high-value woman has transcended this desperate need. She has learned, through perhaps years of having her deepest truths dissected and dismissed by those who mistake analysis for understanding, that some knowledge is too sacred to submit to the crude instruments of rational explanation. Consider the moon, that eternal symbol of feminine wisdom that has pulled at human consciousness since we first lifted our eyes to the night sky. Does the moon explain its phases? Does it justify its waxing and waning with carefully crafted arguments about gravitational pull and orbital mechanics? Does it defend its right to disappear from view, only to return in its own perfect timing? The moon simply is, and in its being, it governs tides, influences the cycles of growth and rest, and calls forth the wild, mysterious aspects of life that refuse to be tamed by explanation. So too does the high-value woman operate according to laws older than language itself. She has discovered within herself an internal compass that society has never learned to read, because it speaks in frequencies that cannot be detected by the instruments of collective consciousness. This compass does not point toward magnetic north, but toward her true north, that place of authentic being where her soul's deepest knowing resides. The architecture of this silent knowing is built upon foundations that extend deep into the unconscious realm, into what Jung called the collective unconscious, that vast repository of human experience that speaks in symbols, dreams, and sudden knowings that arrive like birds landing on the windowsill of consciousness. She has learned to trust these arrivals, these moments when understanding descends not through the laborious process of logical deduction, but through the sudden opening of an inner eye that sees what was always there, waiting to be recognized. This is not the silence of suppression or the muteness of those who have been robbed of voice. This is the silence of the oracle who speaks only when the divine moves through her, who understands that words dilute truth in the same way that too much water weakens wine. She has discovered that the most profound communications happen in the spaces between words, in the pregnant pauses that hold more meaning than entire volumes of explanation. In the cathedral of her inner wisdom, she has encountered what the mystics have always known, that the sacred cannot be captured in concepts, only experienced, that the most important truths cannot be taught, only remembered, that the deepest love cannot be explained, only embodied. This understanding has liberated her from the exhausting task of translating her soul's language into the crude vocabulary of a world that has forgotten how to listen with its heart. She recognizes now that those who truly see her do not need elaborate explanations of her worth, her choices, or her boundaries. They see her value the way one recognizes the beauty of a sunset, not through analysis of light refraction and atmospheric conditions, but through the immediate, undeniable recognition that something sacred is occurring. Those who require constant justification for her being are like people demanding that the sunset explain itself before they will acknowledge its beauty. The shadow side of this knowing, for Jung taught us that every truth casts its shadow, is the loneliness that comes with operating from a place of inner authority in a world that has become addicted to external validation. She may find herself walking paths that others cannot see, making choices that others cannot understand, guided by an inner star that shines only for her. This can feel isolating in a culture that demands consensus reality, that insists all truth be verifiable by committee. Yet this very loneliness is also her initiation into a deeper belonging, not to the shifting opinions of the collective, but to the eternal, unchanging essence of her own being. Like the hermit in the tarot, she carries her own light and discovers that this light illuminates not only her path, but serves as a beacon for others who have grown weary of walking in the shadows of borrowed wisdom. In the depths of her silent knowing, she has encountered what Jung called the self, not the ego self that seeks approval and validation, but the archetypal self that exists beyond the reach of human judgment. This self does not need to explain itself because it is complete unto itself, like a perfect circle that exists, regardless of whether anyone traces its circumference with their finger. She has learned to distinguish between the voice of this deep self and the chattering demands of the ego that once drove her to explain, justify, and defend every choice she made. The ego speaks in the language of fear. What will they think? How will I make them understand? What if they reject me? But the self speaks in the language of being. I am. This is true. This is my path. The transformation from explanation to embodiment is perhaps one of the most radical shifts a woman can make in a culture that has taught her that her worth depends upon her ability to make others comfortable with her choices. She discovers that her energy, that precious, finite resource that she once scattered like seeds on concrete in her attempts to make others understand, is too sacred to waste on those who approach her truth with closed hearts and predetermined conclusions. This is the ancient wisdom that speaks through her now. Some people are not meant to understand her, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack the inner capacity to recognize what they have not cultivated within themselves. A person who has never developed their own relationship with silent knowing cannot comprehend the woman who moves from this place of inner authority. They mistake her certainty for arrogance, her boundaries for coldness, her self-possession for selfishness. But she no longer takes responsibility for their misunderstanding. She has learned that trying to explain depth to those who are committed to surface living is like trying to describe color to someone who insists on seeing only in black and white. The limitation is not in the color, but in the perception. In the cathedral of her silent knowing, she has discovered rooms within rooms, chambers within chambers of understanding that unfold like infinite Russian dolls of wisdom. Each layer of self-knowledge she uncovers reveals another deeper layer. Each truth she integrates opens the door to an even more profound mystery. This is the path of individuation that Jung spoke of, not a destination to be reached, but a journey to be lived. a constant deepening into the mystery of who she truly is, beneath all the roles, masks, and personas she has worn. The high-value woman understands that this process cannot be rushed or explained to those who have not undertaken their own journey into the depths. She knows that consciousness is not democratic, that truth is not subject to popular vote, that wisdom cannot be bestowed upon those who have not paid the price of their own inner work. This knowing liberates her from the futile task of trying to convince others of what they are not ready to understand. She moves now like the moon moves, according to her own rhythm, her own cycle, her own mysterious laws. She waxes and wanes according to the needs of her soul, not the demands of others. She disappears when she needs to retreat into the darkness of inner renewal, and she emerges when her light is ready to shine forth once again. She does not announce her orbit or justify her phases. She simply follows the ancient pattern written in her bones, the sacred geometry of her own becoming. This is the architecture of silent knowing, a structure built not for the comfort of visitors, but for the worship of truth. A cathedral where she can commune with the deepest parts of herself without having to translate the experience for those who have never learned to speak the language of the soul. A sanctuary where her worth is not subject to debate, her value not dependent upon explanation, her being not contingent upon the approval of those who have never learned to recognize the sacred when it stands before them. In this holy space of her own making, she has discovered the freedom that comes with no longer needing to be understood by everyone, the peace that descends when she stops casting her pearls before those who see only stones, the profound relief of finally coming home to herself after years of wandering in the wilderness of other people's expectations and demands for justification. She has learned to read the sacred scripture written in silence and shadow, and in doing so has become both the reader and the text, both the seeker and the sought, both the question and the answer to the mystery of her own magnificent becoming. There comes a moment in every woman's journey toward her authentic self when she stands at the edge of a great recognition, like a traveler who suddenly realizes she has been walking in circles for years, carrying a map written in a language that was never meant to guide her home. This is the moment when she sees, with startling clarity, how much of her life force has been spent in the exhausting labor of translation, converting the native tongue of her soul into dialects that others could digest, diluting her essence until it became palatable to palates that were never meant to taste the full strength of her truth. The high-value woman arrives at this threshold worn thin as parchment, her edges softened not by wisdom but by the constant friction of trying to make herself understood by minds that approached her with predetermined definitions of who she should be. She has been both scholar and interpreter of her own experience, endlessly parsing the rich, complex language of her inner world into simplified sentences that could be processed by those who insisted on understanding her through the narrow lens of their own limitations. Jung spoke of the persona, that mask we wear to navigate the social world, but what he observed less frequently was the particular exhaustion that comes when the persona becomes not just a social lubricant, but a constant translation service. She has spent years, perhaps decades, serving as ambassador between the country of her authentic self and the foreign territories of other people's expectations. The toll of this diplomatic work has accumulated in ways she is only now beginning to recognize. In the depths of her being, where the truest thoughts rise like spring water from some underground source, she has always known things that others seemed incapable of grasping without elaborate explanation. She knew when relationships were dying long before the final arguments began. She sensed the hollowness behind certain promises before they were broken. She felt the pull toward new directions, while others were still insisting she stay the course. This knowing came to her not through analysis, but through what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious capacity of the psyche to perceive patterns and meanings that exist beyond the reach of rational thought. But the world around her operated on different principles. It demanded evidence, required justification, insisted on proof for what she simply knew. So she learned to become a translator of her own truth, spending precious energy constructing elaborate bridges between her inner knowing and the external demand for explanation. She learned to speak in the language of reasons rather than the language of recognition, to provide logical frameworks for what was essentially a non-logical understanding. The exhaustion crept in gradually, like water seeping through foundation stones. At first, she told herself that this translation work was simply part of being understood, part of connecting with others, part of the natural give and take of relationship. She convinced herself that those who loved her would eventually learn to read her native language if she just found the right words, the perfect analogies, the most compelling arguments for the validity of her experience. But years of this labor revealed a devastating truth. Those who truly valued her never required these elaborate translations in the first place. They recognized the sound of authenticity, the way a musician recognizes perfect pitch, immediately, instinctively, without needing to analyze the frequency. Meanwhile, those who demanded constant explanation, who insisted on dissertations to justify her simplest truths, did so not from a genuine desire to understand, but from an unconscious need to maintain control over the narrative of who she was allowed to be. She began to see the pattern with the clarity that comes only from having lived it repeatedly. The conversations that went in circles because the other person was not actually listening but merely waiting for her to stop talking so they could deliver their predetermined response. The relationships where her carefully crafted explanations were received, like water poured into sand, absorbed without trace or transformation. The friendships where she found herself perpetually defending her right to feel what she felt, know what she knew, choose what she chose. In Jung's understanding of psychological development, there comes what he called the enantiodromia, the point where something transforms into its opposite, where a psychological pattern exhausts itself and gives birth to its contrary. For the high-value woman, this moment arrives when she realizes that her gift for translation has become a prison, her capacity for explanation a chain that binds her to those who have no genuine interest in understanding her essence. The shadow of her translating gift reveals itself. She has been enabling others to remain unconscious by doing their emotional and psychological work for them. By constantly explaining herself, she has allowed others to avoid the discomfort of stretching their own capacity for understanding. By serving as interpreter between her truth and their comfort, she has inadvertently participated in maintaining the very dynamics that exhaust her. This recognition brings with it a grief that runs as deep as underground rivers. She mourns not only the energy she has spent in futile explanation, but the parts of herself she has compressed, simplified, and diminished in the service of being understood by those who were never truly listening. She grieves for the brilliant, complex, multifaceted truths she has reduced to sound bites for minds that preferred their reality predigested and non-threatening. She sees now how she has been complicit in her own diminishment, how her very gifts of articulation and empathy have been weaponized against her authentic self. Her ability to see multiple perspectives has been twisted into an obligation to justify her own. Her capacity for nuanced understanding has been exploited by those who demanded increasingly elaborate explanations while offering no corresponding effort to meet her halfway in the space of mutual comprehension. The woman who has reached this point of exhaustion finds herself standing at a crossroads that every authentic being must eventually navigate. The choice between continuing to exhaust herself in the service of being understood by those who are incapable of understanding, or withdrawing her translation services and allowing others to encounter her truth in its native form. Untranslated, undiluted, and utterly uncompromising in its authenticity. This is not the bitter withdrawal of someone who has given up on connection, but the wise conservation of energy that comes from recognizing what Jung called the principle of equivalent energy. If she stops pouring her life force into the black hole of endless explanation, that energy becomes available for more nourishing pursuits. The libido that was bound up in futile translation can be redirected toward creation, toward relationships that operate on the frequency of mutual recognition, toward endeavors that honor rather than diminish her essential nature. She begins to understand that her worth was never dependent upon her ability to make herself comprehensible to minds that approached her with predetermined conclusions. She sees that the people who truly matter in her life have always been able to read her deeper communications, the ones transmitted through presence, through energy, through the subtle languages of the heart that need no verbal translation. The recognition dawns like sunrise after the longest night. Those who genuinely value her do not require her to prove her worth through elaborate explanation. They sense her value the way one senses the presence of the sacred, immediately, viscerally, without needing to deconstruct the experience to validate its reality. They meet her truth with their own truth, creating a resonance that requires no translation because it operates in the realm of direct recognition. Meanwhile, those who have demanded endless explanation, who have treated her deepest truths like debatable propositions rather than lived realities, reveal themselves to be operating from a place of unconscious entitlement. They expect her to serve not only as herself, but as the interpreter of herself, to be both the phenomenon and the commentary on the phenomenon, both the experience and the explanation of why that experience is valid. This expectation, she realizes, is a form of psychological colonization. It demands that she abandon her native language, the language of intuitive knowing, of felt sense, of embodied wisdom, and communicate only in the approved dialects of rational justification. It insists that her inner authority submit to external validation before it can be considered legitimate. It requires her to seek permission for her own experience from those who have never undertaken the journey necessary to understand that experience from the inside. The exhaustion she feels is not merely tiredness, but a deep soul weariness that comes from having betrayed her own essence repeatedly in the service of being accepted by those who could only accept a diminished version of who she truly is. She has been like a master painter, forced to work only in watercolor, when her vision requires the full spectrum of oil paints, like a symphony composer asked to express her compositions on a child's toy piano. As she stands in this recognition, she begins to feel something stirring beneath the exhaustion, something that Jung would recognize as the emergence of the self, that deeper identity that exists beyond the reach of social approval or disapproval. This self does not speak the language of explanation, but of declaration. It does not ask for permission, but claims its sovereign right to exist. It does not translate itself for the comfort of others, but stands in its own truth. Like a mountain stands in the landscape, unapologetically present, requiring no justification for its existence. The shift from explanation to embodiment begins here, in this moment of recognizing the futility of casting her pearls before those who see only stones. She understands now that her energy is too precious to waste on hearts that have chosen blindness over sight, too sacred to pour into vessels that have no capacity to hold the full measure of what she offers. This is not cruelty but discernment. It is not closing her heart but opening it more fully to those who can receive what she has to give, without requiring her to dim her light or translate her truth into more palatable forms. She is learning to distinguish between those who approach her with genuine curiosity about who she truly is, and those who approach her with demands that she conform to their preconceived notions of who she should be. The woman who has exhausted herself in endless translation begins to reclaim her native tongue. She starts to speak once again in the language of her deepest knowing, trusting that those who are meant to understand will recognize the sound of authenticity, even if they cannot parse every word. She discovers that her truth, when spoken in its original form rather than its translated version, carries a power that no amount of explanation could ever achieve. She learns to say simply, "This is true for me," without feeling compelled to build elaborate cases for why others should accept that truth. She practices stating her boundaries without providing detailed justifications for why those boundaries exist. She experiments with making choices based on her inner guidance, without offering dissertations on the validity of that guidance to those who have never learned to trust their own inner voice. This reclamation of her authentic voice is both liberation and grief. Liberation from the exhausting burden of constant translation, and grief for all the years spent believing that her worth was contingent upon her ability to make others understand her. She mourns the relationships that could not survive her refusal to diminish herself, while simultaneously celebrating the deeper connections that become possible when she shows up in her full truth rather than her translated version. The woman who stops exhausting herself in endless translation discovers something Jung knew well, that the individuation process requires us to disappoint those who can only love us in our diminished form. It requires us to risk being misunderstood by those who have never been willing to undertake the work of truly understanding. It asks us to choose our own psychological survival over the comfort of those who prefer us, small, manageable, and endlessly explanatory about our right to exist as we are. In the end, she realizes that the exhaustion of endless translation was never really about communication. It was about the futile attempt to earn love and acceptance from those who were fundamentally unavailable for the kind of relationship her soul required. She was trying to translate herself into forms that could be received by those who lacked the capacity to receive her, like trying to broadcast a symphony through a radio that can only receive AM signals. The high-value woman learns to tune her transmission to frequencies that can carry the full range of her truth, trusting that those with the right receivers will pick up her signal clearly, while those operating on different frequencies will simply receive static, and that this is not her responsibility to fix, but theirs to recognize and address if they choose to do so. In the depths of relationship's shadow realm, where the light of conscious awareness has not yet penetrated, she discovers the bitter alchemy that transforms gold into lead, the mysterious process by which her most precious offerings are converted into resentment, her deepest investments into wells of emptiness that no amount of giving can fill. Here, in this dark territory of the psyche that Jung knew was as necessary to explore as it was painful to inhabit, she encounters the shadow of her own giving nature, the devastating pattern of unreciprocated investment that has shaped her relational world like water carving canyons through stone. The high-value woman stands at the edge of this recognition, like an explorer who has suddenly realized that the map she has been following leads not to treasure but to a mirage that recedes infinitely into the distance. She sees now, with the brutal clarity that only comes through lived experience, how her consistent explanations, her patient teaching, Her endless emotional labor has been received, like water poured into sand, absorbed without trace, vanishing without transformation, leaving no evidence of the river of energy that once flowed there. This is not the clean pain of obvious betrayal or dramatic abandonment, but the slow hemorrhaging of the soul that occurs when one's deepest investments meet not with rejection, which would at least provide the clarity of a definitive response, but with the soul-crushing indifference of those who take without recognizing they are receiving, who consume without acknowledging the source of their nourishment, who benefit from her abundance while remaining unconscious of the cost at which it is offered. Jung understood that the shadow contains not only our disowned darkness, but also our disowned light, the aspects of ourselves that we have given away so completely that we no longer recognize them as our own. The woman who has spent years in unreciprocated investment has projected her own capacity for depth, commitment, and authentic care onto others, hoping to see it reflected back to her, only to discover that she has been nurturing qualities in others that they do not possess, watering gardens that exist only in her imagination. She begins to trace the pattern backward through time, like an archaeologist uncovering layers of buried civilizations, each stratum revealing another instance of the same devastating dynamic. The relationship where she poured months of careful explanation into someone who remained stubbornly committed to misunderstanding her, the friendship where she served as unpaid therapist, emotional coordinator, and perpetual source of wisdom and support, only to discover that her own struggles were met with impatience or dismissal, the partnerships where she functioned as both participant and translator, both lover and teacher, both woman and interpreter of what it means to love a woman. The shadow work required to face this pattern is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of psychological development, because it demands that she confront not only how others have failed her, but how she has failed herself. She must examine the unconscious agreements she has made, the ways she has participated in her own diminishment, the unspoken contracts that allowed others to benefit from her investment while remaining unconscious of their role in the exchange. In the beginning, before consciousness dawned, she believed that love was a substance that multiplied when shared, that emotional investment naturally generated returns, that patient teaching would eventually produce understanding. She operated from what Jung would recognize as a compensation fantasy, the unconscious belief that by giving others what she herself needed, she would eventually receive it back in equal measure. She was both investor and investment, both giver and the gift she hoped to receive. But the shadow realm reveals the darker truth, that not all investments are made in fertile ground, that not all recipients of care are capable of reciprocating it, that there exists a fundamental asymmetry in the capacity for emotional depth that no amount of explanation, teaching, or patient investment can overcome. She discovers that she has been operating on the assumption that others possessed the same emotional architecture as herself, the same capacity for introspection, the same hunger for authentic connection, the same willingness to do the inner work that relationship requires. The pattern reveals itself with startling, almost mathematical precision. Those who truly value her understand without lengthy exposition, recognize her worth without requiring proof, reciprocate her investment without being taught how to give. They meet her energy with their own energy, her depth with their own depth, her commitment with their own commitment. The exchange is not perfectly balanced in every moment, for real relationship breathes like a living thing, sometimes giving more, sometimes receiving more, but over time there is a fundamental reciprocity, a mutual recognition of value and worth. Meanwhile, those who demand constant explanation do so from a place of unconscious entitlement that runs deeper than conscious malice. They have never developed their own capacity for emotional investment, never learned to recognize the preciousness of what she offers, never cultivated the inner resources necessary to reciprocate authentic care. They approach her abundance like tourists in a foreign country, taking what they need without learning the language, consuming the culture without contributing to its preservation. This entitlement operates through a peculiar form of psychological blindness that allows them to receive her investment while remaining unconscious of its cost. They benefit from her emotional labor while never recognizing it as labor. They consume her explanations without understanding the energy required to produce them. They take her patient teaching for granted while never questioning why they require so much teaching in the first place. She realizes now that she has been participating in a form of emotional colonization, allowing others to extract the resources of her inner world without offering equivalent value in return. Like a country rich in natural resources that exports its wealth while its own people remain impoverished, she has been giving away her emotional treasures to those who could never reciprocate the depth of her investment, leaving herself depleted while they remained oblivious to the source of their enrichment. The shadow of unreciprocated investment reveals itself not only in romantic relationships, but in the entire ecosystem of her connections. She sees it in the friendships where she has served as the perpetual giver of advice, the reliable source of support, the one who remembers birthdays and anniversaries, while her own important moments pass unacknowledged. She recognizes it in professional relationships, where her ideas are absorbed and credited to others, where her emotional intelligence is utilized without recognition, where her contributions are taken as a given rather than celebrated as a gift. The most devastating aspect of this recognition is not the behavior of others, for Jung taught us that we cannot control the unconsciousness of others, only our own participation in it, but the realization of how she has betrayed her own worth by accepting relationships that operated on such fundamentally unequal terms. She sees how she has trained others to undervalue her by consistently accepting their lack of reciprocity, how she has enabled their unconsciousness by doing their emotional work for them, how she has participated in her own depletion by refusing to acknowledge the obvious asymmetry in the exchange. This is the shadow work that Jung knew was essential for individuation, facing not only how others have wounded us, but how we have wounded ourselves through our own unconscious patterns. She must confront the ways she has used giving as a strategy for earning love, the ways she has confused over-functioning with caring, the ways she has enabled others to remain emotional children by accepting the role of emotional parent in relationship after relationship. The compensation pattern becomes clear, having perhaps grown up in an environment where love was conditional upon her ability to give, to understand, to accommodate the needs of others. She developed an unconscious belief that her worth was directly proportional to her usefulness. She learned to be indispensable as a strategy for ensuring she would not be abandoned, not recognizing that this very strategy attracted those who were looking for someone to manage their emotional lives rather than share them. The woman trapped in patterns of unreciprocated investment often possesses a highly developed capacity for empathy that becomes a double-edged gift. She can sense the potential in others long before that potential is actualized, can see the gold beneath the dross, can recognize the wounded places that drive their inability to reciprocate. This gift becomes a curse when she begins to invest in the potential rather than the reality, when she gives to who someone might become rather than who they actually are in the present moment. She realizes that she has been guilty of a peculiar form of projection, projecting her own capacity for growth, change, and reciprocity onto those who have given her no evidence of possessing these qualities. She has been loving others for their potential while accepting crumbs in the present, investing in futures that exist only in her imagination, while depleting herself in relationships that offer no nourishment in return. The shadow realm also reveals the hidden arrogance in her pattern of overgiving, the unconscious belief that she could love others into transformation, that her patient investment could awaken capacities that they had never chosen to develop, that her explanations could create understanding in those who were committed to remaining unconscious. This arrogance, dressed in the clothing of generosity, has kept her trapped in relationships with those who benefit from her consciousness while contributing none of their own. Jung's concept of the shadow includes what he called the inferior function, those aspects of ourselves that remain undeveloped and primitive. For the woman caught in patterns of unreciprocated investment, her inferior function is often the capacity for healthy selfishness, for protective boundaries, for the kind of discrimination that can distinguish between those who are capable of reciprocity and those who are not. Her developed empathy has overshadowed her capacity for discernment. Her gift for understanding has eclipsed her ability to protect herself from those who would consume her understanding without offering any in return. The recognition of this pattern brings with it a grief that extends beyond the specific relationships in which it has played out. She mourns not only the energy she has invested without return, but the parts of herself she has neglected while over-functioning for others. She grieves the dreams she has deferred, the projects she has abandoned, the aspects of her own growth she has sacrificed, while investing in the growth of those who never reciprocated her investment in their development. But within this grief lies the seed of liberation. As she faces the shadow of unreciprocated investment, she begins to understand that her capacity for deep investment is not a flaw to be corrected, but a gift to be directed more wisely. The problem has never been her ability to give deeply, but her failure to choose recipients who could match her depth, her tendency to cast her pearls before those who could not recognize their value. The transformation begins not with becoming less generous, but with becoming more discriminating in her generosity. She learns to recognize the signs of reciprocal capacity in others, not the potential for reciprocity, but the actual demonstrated ability to match her investment with their own. She develops what Jung would call a more mature relationship with her own shadow, acknowledging both her light and her darkness, her capacity for profound giving and her need to receive in equal measure. She begins to understand that true reciprocity is not a mathematical equation, but a musical harmony, each person contributing their own unique note to create something more beautiful than either could produce alone. But harmony requires that both parties show up with their instruments, that both bring their full presence and capacity to the relationship. She has been trying to create symphonies with partners who brought only silence, attempting to generate harmony with those who had never learned to carry a tune. The high-value woman emerges from the shadow work of recognizing unreciprocated investment with a new understanding of her own worth. She no longer sees her capacity for deep investment as a burden to be managed, but as a treasure to be shared only with those who can recognize its value. She learns to invest in relationships that nourish her growth rather than deplete her resources, to share her depth with those who can meet her in the depths rather than those who expect her to remain in the shallows for their comfort. This is the completion of a crucial phase in the individuation process, the recognition that her light is too precious to be dimmed for the comfort of those who prefer darkness, her depth too valuable to be wasted on those who are committed to surface living, her investment too sacred to be poured into relationships that cannot hold the full measure of what she offers. She has learned to distinguish between those who receive her gifts with gratitude and reciprocity, and those who consume her offerings while remaining unconscious of their source and significance. In the liminal space where fury meets wisdom, where the sacred intersects with the profane necessity of human relationships, there exists a moment of terrible recognition. It arrives like lightning splitting open the night sky of consciousness, sudden, illuminating and forever altering the landscape of the soul. This is the moment when a woman of depth, a woman who has lived with her heart extended like an offering bowl, realizes that her words have become weapons in the hands of those she trusted with her truth. The collective unconscious holds within its vast chambers the echoing voices of countless women who have stood at the threshold of departure, their throats raw from explanations that fell upon ears sealed shut by willful deafness. These are the women who believed, with that beautiful, terrible innocence that marks the truly generous spirit, that understanding could be achieved through the multiplication of words, that clarity would emerge from the endless elaboration of feeling, that love could be taught through the patient articulation of need. But in this sacred fury that rises now, volcanic and undeniable, there lives a knowing that transcends the individual experience. It is the wisdom of the archetypal feminine principle, recognizing its own violation, not in the crude sense of physical transgression, but in the more subtle and perhaps more devastating realm of spiritual appropriation. For when a woman's vulnerability becomes strategy in another's hands, when her tender explanations are transmuted into manipulative ammunition, something fundamental has been corrupted in the sacred exchange of human intimacy. This fury is not the petty anger of wounded pride, though it may disguise itself as such in its earliest manifestations. No, this is the righteous indignation of the soul itself, recognizing that its most precious offerings have been commodified, packaged, and redistributed as weapons against its own sanctuary. It is the rage of Persephone realizing that her descent into the underworld was not a noble sacrifice for growth, but an abduction disguised as transformation. It is the wrath of Psyche understanding that her labors of love have been perverted into tests designed not to prove her worthiness, but to exhaust her will to seek worthiness elsewhere. The high-value woman, and here we must pause to understand what this phrase truly means, in the depths of psychological reality, is not defined by external validators or social currencies. She is the woman who has done the sacred work of individuation, who has descended into her own underworld and emerged with the golden treasure of self-knowing. She has integrated her shadow, embraced her wholeness, and learned to distinguish between the voice of her authentic self and the cacophony of projected expectations. Such a woman recognizes the sacred fury not as a destructive force, but as the guardian at the threshold of her own becoming. In the mythology of her leaving, she begins to see the patterns that Jung would recognize as the eternal drama of projection and withdrawal. Those who have consistently failed to truly hear her words, who have instead heard only what served their own narrative, their own need to remain unchanged, have created around her a hall of mirrors in which her voice echoes back, distorted beyond recognition. Her expressions of need become accusations of their inadequacy. Her explanations of feeling become manipulations designed to control. Her vulnerabilities become evidence of her instability, her complexity, her fundamental unsuitability for the simple container they have prepared for her being. This is the moment when the archetypal wise woman within her awakens from the slumber of endless accommodation. She sees with crystalline clarity how her own generous nature has been exploited, not maliciously perhaps, but exploited nonetheless. The pattern reveals itself like a constellation suddenly visible in a darkened sky. Every explanation she has offered has been gathered, stored, and weaponized. Her past words become the very chains that bind her to relationships that drain rather than nourish, that diminish rather than celebrate the fullness of her being. The sacred fury recognizes this commodification of truth as a form of spiritual violence. When a woman's heartfelt explanations are dissected, analyzed, and repurposed as evidence of her fundamental flaws, something precious dies in the exchange. The trust that allows for genuine intimacy withers like a flower touched by frost. The willingness to be seen in all her human complexity hardens into protective armor. The beautiful vulnerability that marks the truly alive soul retreats behind walls built from the very words she once offered as bridges. Yet within this fury lies a profound initiation. For the woman who can feel the full weight of her own violation without becoming bitter, who can acknowledge the sacred anger without letting it consume her capacity for future love, discovers within herself a discriminating wisdom that transcends both naive giving and cynical withholding. She learns to recognize the quality of listening that exists in her presence, not the polite nodding that masquerades as attention, but the deep receptivity that can hold the fullness of another's truth, without needing to reshape it into something more palatable. The archetypal dimension of this experience connects her to the great mythic figures who have faced similar crossroads. She is Inanna, who descended into the underworld and emerged transformed, no longer willing to accept relationships that require her to remain small. She is Artemis, the fierce guardian of her own sacred space, who demands that those who would enter her realm prove their worthiness not through conquest, but through reverence. She is Kali, the destroyer of illusions, who wields the sword of truth that cuts away what is false to reveal what is eternally real. This sacred fury teaches her that some battles cannot be won through explanation, that some minds cannot be opened through the multiplication of words, that some hearts have become so defended against their own growth that they will transform every gesture of love into an attack upon their chosen stagnation. The woman who has learned to honor this fury understands that her energy is not an unlimited resource to be poured into the endless task of making herself understood by those who have no genuine desire to understand. In the depths of this recognition, she begins to see how her own unconscious patterns have participated in this dynamic. The shadow aspect of her generous nature, the way her giving has sometimes been motivated not by pure love, but by the need to prove her worthiness, to demonstrate her value through the endless performance of explanation and accommodation. She sees how her fear of being misunderstood has led her to over-explain, how her terror of abandonment has driven her to justify her very existence to those who should have been grateful simply for her presence. This is where the fury becomes sacred rather than merely destructive. For in seeing her own complicity in the pattern, she is empowered to break it. She no longer needs to prove her worth through the exhaustive documentation of her inner life. She no longer needs to make herself smaller so that others can remain comfortable in their chosen limitations. The fury burns away the false humility that has kept her explaining herself to those who have already decided what they want to see. The collective unconscious holds this pattern because it is not merely personal, but archetypal. Across cultures and throughout history, women of depth have faced the challenge of being truly seen without being dissected, of being loved without being diminished, of being heard without being translated into something more convenient for others to handle. The sacred fury that rises in response to this pattern is not pathology, but wisdom, the soul's recognition that some forms of connection are actually disconnection disguised. Some forms of love are actually possession masked as intimacy. As this fury moves through her being like a cleansing fire, she begins to understand that her words have been sacred offerings placed upon altars that were never consecrated to receive them. Her explanations have been prayers spoken in languages that others chose not to learn. Her vulnerabilities have been gifts given to those who saw them only as opportunities for advantage. The woman awakening to her own high value, her inherent worth as a complete being rather than a project to be improved or a puzzle to be solved, recognizes that some offerings must be withdrawn from altars that have proven themselves unworthy. This is not the withdrawal of the wounded, but the discernment of the wise, for she has learned the difference between those who genuinely cannot understand and those who will not understand, between the person struggling with their own limitations and the person who has made a choice to remain closed to growth. The sacred fury teaches her to reserve her deepest explanations for those who have demonstrated their capacity to hold them with reverence rather than use them as weapons. In the alchemical process of this recognition, she discovers that her anger is not something to be transcended, but something to be honored as a messenger. It carries information about the boundaries that have been crossed, the trust that has been violated, the sacred made profane through misuse. When she can feel this fury without shame, when she can acknowledge its justice without becoming consumed by its fire, she accesses a power that transcends both victim consciousness and perpetrator energy. The sacred fury reveals to her that her words, her explanations, her patient articulations of inner truth are not weapons to be deployed in the service of making others change. They are not tools for manipulation or strategies for control. They are offerings of the soul, gifts of intimate connection, invitations into the deeper chambers of human communion. When they are received as such, they create bonds of genuine understanding. When they are twisted into something else, they become violations of the sacred trust that makes love possible. This fury burns away the illusion that she can love others into wholeness through the sheer force of her understanding. It destroys the fantasy that enough explanation will finally break through the walls of willful misunderstanding. It reduces to ash the belief that her worth as a human being depends upon her ability to make herself comprehensible to those who have chosen incomprehension as their defensive strategy. What remains after this burning is not cynicism, but clarity. Not the inability to love, but the wisdom to love skillfully. Not the closing of her heart, but the opening of her discernment. The woman who has been initiated by this sacred fury learns to recognize the quality of receptivity in others. Not their words about being open, but their actual capacity to be changed by encounter with her truth. She understands now that her explanations have been prayers, and like all authentic prayers, they were never meant to control the response of the divine, but to create an opening for genuine meeting. When her words fall into the fertile soil of a receptive consciousness, they create gardens of understanding. When they fall upon the hardened ground of a defended ego, they cannot take root, no matter how many times they are repeated or how carefully they are cultivated. The sacred fury teaches her that some departures require no explanation, because the explanation has already been given countless times in countless ways to ears that have chosen deafness. It teaches her that her energy is too precious to be spent on the hopeless task of making the blind see light they have no desire to perceive. It reveals to her that silence, too, can be a form of communication, a final offering to those who have proven themselves unable to receive the gifts of her words. In this recognition, she begins to reclaim the sovereignty that has been slowly bled away through the endless performance of justification. Her life force, her creative energy, her emotional availability, these are not public utilities to be accessed by anyone who demands explanation. They are precious resources to be stewarded wisely, shared generously with those who have proven their capacity to honor such gifts, and withdrawn without guilt from those who have demonstrated their inability to receive them without corruption. The alchemical transformation taking place within her consciousness is the movement from unconscious giving to conscious offering, from compulsive explanation to discerning communication, from the desperate need to be understood to the peaceful confidence in her own self-knowing. The sacred fury serves as the catalyst for this transformation, burning away the dross of people-pleasing and revealing the gold of authentic self-respect. As she moves through this initiation, she begins to understand that her words have power, not because of their ability to change others, but because of their capacity to create authentic connection with those who are ready for such meeting. She learns to recognize the difference between explanation as manipulation, the desperate attempt to control others' perceptions, and explanation as gift, the generous sharing of inner truth with those who have demonstrated their worthiness to receive it. The collective unconscious from which this fury arises holds not only the pain of countless women whose words have been weaponized, but also the wisdom of those who have learned to transform this violation into initiation. It carries the memory of every woman who has chosen to honor her own sacred fury as a teacher rather than suppress it as an inconvenience, who has allowed it to burn away what is false in her relationships so that what is true might finally emerge. This is the fury that says, "My words are not instruments for your comfort, but expressions of my truth. My explanations are not meant to make you feel better about your choices, but to create possibilities for genuine understanding. My vulnerability is not your weapon, but my offering, and if you cannot receive it as sacred, then you forfeit the privilege of receiving it at all." In the depths of this recognition, she finds not hardness, but clarity, not closure, but discernment, not the inability to love, but the wisdom to love, in ways that honor both herself and those worthy of such honor. The sacred fury becomes the guardian at the threshold of her heart, ensuring that only those capable of reverence may enter the sanctuary of her deepest truth. In the hidden chambers of the soul, where the ancient wisdom of self-preservation dwells, like a serpent coiled in sacred darkness, a profound initiation begins. It is the learning of silence as sanctuary, the understanding that not all departures require the ceremony of explanation, that some transformations must occur in the protected darkness of one's own becoming. Like the snake that seeks solitude for its most vulnerable moments of shedding, the woman of depth begins to recognize that her leaving, this sacred act of withdrawal from what no longer serves her highest becoming, need not be performed upon the stage of others' understanding. This initiation into self-preservation is not born from cruelty, but from the hard-won wisdom that recognizes the futility of casting pearls before those who see only stones. The archetypal wise woman within her has awakened to a truth that cuts through the conditioning of a lifetime. Those who have consistently demonstrated their inability to truly hear her words will not suddenly develop the capacity for deeper listening simply because she is saying goodbye. The ears that have been deaf to her joy, her pain, her growth, her needs, these same ears will not magically open to receive the sacred communication of her departure. In the mythology of transformation, the snake does not announce its shedding to the forest. It does not gather the woodland creatures to explain why its current skin no longer serves, why it must retreat into hidden places to emerge renewed. The snake understands, with an intelligence that transcends the realm of explanation, that transformation is an internal process that requires protection from the scrutiny and judgment of those who cannot comprehend the necessity of such radical becoming. The woman entering this initiation begins to feel the ancient stirring of this serpentine wisdom within her own being. She recognizes that her previous attempts at explaining her departures have been like trying to describe the color blue to those who have chosen blindness, not only futile but draining of the very energy she needs for her own transformation. Each word spent in justification has been energy stolen from her future, consciousness leaked into a past that has already proven its unworthiness of such precious offerings. This is the moment when she begins to understand silence not as punishment, but as protection. Protection of her own tender process of becoming, protection of the sacred space within which her true self is struggling to emerge. The silence that accompanies her leaving is not withholding but conservation, not cruelty but clarity about where her energy can be most wisely invested. She learns to distinguish between the silence of spite and the silence of sovereignty, between the withholding born of anger and the boundaries born of wisdom. In the depths of Jungian understanding, this represents a crucial movement in the individuation process, the moment when the ego stops sacrificing itself on the altar of others' comfort and begins to serve the deeper self that seeks expression through authentic living. The woman undergoing this initiation recognizes that her compulsive need to explain her every move has been a form of unconscious servitude to the collective's demand that she remain comprehensible, manageable, controllable. The shadow aspect of her generous nature reveals itself in this process. She sees how her endless explanations have sometimes been motivated not by love but by fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of being abandoned, fear of being labeled difficult or unreasonable. This shadow of explanation as defense has kept her trapped in relationships and situations that required her to constantly justify her very existence, her feelings, her needs, her natural growth and evolution as a conscious being. The snake sheds its skin in private, not because it is ashamed of its transformation, but because it understands that the process of renewal requires an environment free from interference. The old skin must be allowed to loosen and fall away, without the well-meaning attempts of others to help or hinder the process. The emerging self must be allowed to breathe, without immediately being subjected to the judgments and projections of those who were comfortable with the previous version. As this wisdom integrates into her being, she begins to recognize the profound self-respect inherent in choosing silence over explanation. She understands that her departure without detailed justification is not an act of aggression, but an act of honoring the sacred nature of her own transformation. Those who truly love her, who have genuinely seen and valued her authentic self, will understand that her leaving speaks to needs that transcend their particular relationship or situation. They will trust in her wisdom and wish her well on her journey, even if they cannot follow where she must go. But those who demand explanation, who feel entitled to a detailed accounting of her inner processes, reveal through their very demands that they have never truly seen her as a sovereign being. They have related to her as an extension of themselves, a character in their story rather than the protagonist of her own. The initiation teaches her to recognize this difference with crystalline clarity, to see who relates to her as a complete being worthy of her own mysterious depths, and who relates to her as an object that should remain transparent and manageable. The ancient feminine principle of self-preservation that awakens within her is not the modern concept of self-care as surface remedy, but the profound wisdom that recognizes when retreat is necessary for survival, when silence is required for authentic expression, when withdrawal becomes the highest form of self-respect. This is the wisdom of the wise woman archetype, she who has learned through experience when to speak and when to conserve her words, when to explain, and when to simply act from her own deep knowing. In the protected space of her silent leaving, she begins to understand that explanation can become its own form of spiritual materialism. The ego's attempt to control how it is perceived, to manage others' reactions, to avoid the discomfort of being misunderstood. The liberated woman recognizes that she cannot control how others interpret her actions, and more importantly, she begins to understand that their interpretations say more about them than they do about her. This initiation reveals to her the addictive quality of over-explanation, how it feeds the parts of her that seek validation, that need to be seen as reasonable, that fear the wild spaces of being misunderstood. She sees how her compulsive explaining has been a form of emotional contortion, twisting herself into shapes that others could more easily digest, translating the poetry of her inner life into the prose that others found less threatening. The snake's wisdom teaches her that some transformations can only occur in solitude, that some becomings require protection from the input and interference of others. Her silent departure becomes a chrysalis, a protected space within which the caterpillar of who she has been can dissolve into the primordial soup of pure potential, eventually emerging as the butterfly of who she is becoming. This process cannot be explained because it transcends the realm of linear narrative. It exists in the mythic dimension where death and rebirth dance their eternal spiral. As she moves through this initiation, she begins to feel the relief that comes with releasing the burden of making herself understood by those who have chosen not to understand. It is like setting down a weight she didn't realize she was carrying, the exhausting responsibility of being comprehensible to minds that have no genuine curiosity about her depths, the draining obligation to justify her growth to those who are invested in her remaining static. The silence of her departure becomes a form of blessing, both for herself and for those she leaves behind. For her, it provides the protected space necessary for authentic transformation. For them, it offers the opportunity to confront their own reactions without the distraction of her explanations, to face whatever arises in the absence of her constant accommodation of their needs and expectations. This is where the initiation reveals its deepest wisdom, that some of the greatest gifts we can offer others are the gifts of our absence when our presence has become a crutch that prevents their own growth, our silence when our words have become a buffer against their need to develop their own understanding, our departure when our staying enables patterns that serve no one's highest becoming. The woman learning this sacred art of self-preservation begins to trust in the intelligence of her own instincts, the subtle knowing that tells her when explanation will serve connection and when it will merely feed dysfunction, when words will build bridges and when they will simply provide more ammunition for those who have made her the enemy in their own internal dramas. She learns to distinguish between the people who genuinely cannot understand and deserve compassion, and those who will not understand because understanding would require them to change, to grow, to acknowledge their own participation in patterns of mutual diminishment. In the hermit's cave of her own discernment, she discovers that her energy is not an unlimited resource to be spent on the hopeless task of making the deaf hear music they have no desire to appreciate. She begins to understand her attention as a form of prayer, her presence as a form of blessing, her explanations as sacred offerings that deserve to be received with reverence rather than dissected for weaknesses or twisted into weapons of emotional warfare. The initiation teaches her to honor the natural cycles of relationship, the seasons of coming together and growing apart, the rhythms of intimacy and solitude, the dance of encounter and withdrawal that characterizes all authentic connection. She learns that not every ending requires a formal ceremony, that not every departure demands a detailed explanation, that some chapters of life close with ellipses rather than exclamation points. This wisdom connects her to the great archetypal pattern of death and rebirth that governs all authentic transformation. Just as winter does not explain itself to the trees, it strips of their leaves. Just as the tide does not justify its withdrawal to the shore it has caressed, her departure without explanation honors the natural intelligence that governs all cycles of ending and beginning. The woman who has been initiated into this form of self-preservation discovers within herself a quality of presence that is no longer dependent upon external validation or understanding. She becomes like a tree that grows toward the light, regardless of who notices or approves, like a river that follows its natural course, regardless of who tries to dam or redirect its flow. Her silence becomes not the absence of communication, but the presence of a deeper form of expression, the wordless communication of a being who knows her own worth and no longer needs to prove it through the endless performance of explanation. In this sacred silence, she finds the space to hear her own voice clearly, not the voice that has been shaped by years of trying to be understood by those who chose not to see her, but the authentic voice of her deepest self, the voice that speaks in whispers and dreams, in intuitions and sudden knowings, in the language of the soul that transcends all need for external translation. The initiation of self-preservation becomes, paradoxically, an initiation into a deeper form of generosity, the generosity of allowing others to face the consequences of their own choices without her constant intervention, the generosity of trusting that those who truly belong in her life will understand her essential goodness even when they cannot comprehend her specific actions, the generosity of offering the world her authentic becoming rather than her accommodating performance. As she moves through this transformation, she begins to understand that her silent departure is not an ending, but a beginning, not the closing of her heart, but the opening of her discernment, not the failure of love, but the success of wisdom in recognizing where love can flourish and where it can only wither under the weight of misunderstanding and misuse. The snake emerges from its hidden place of shedding with skin that gleams like polished moonlight, supple and strong, perfectly fitted to the creature it has become, rather than clinging to the form it has outgrown. So too does the woman emerge from her initiation into self-preservation, not hardened but clarified, not closed but discerning, not unable to love but finally able to love, in ways that honor the sacredness of her own becoming and the authentic potential of those worthy of her deepest gifts. In the consecrated solitude of her own becoming, where the alchemical fires of transformation burn without witness or interference, she discovers the most dangerous power known to the individuated soul, the sovereign right to withdraw her life force without negotiation, justification, or the seeking of permission from those who have grown accustomed to its freely given abundance. This is not the petty withholding of the wounded ego, nor the manipulative silence of passive aggression, but the profound recognition of her own energetic sovereignty, the understanding that her attention, her presence, her emotional availability are not public resources to be consumed by any who demand access, but sacred offerings to be bestowed with the discernment of one who has learned to distinguish between the deserving and the entitled. In the hidden chambers where Jung's deepest insights illuminate the architecture of the psyche, we find the truth that energy is the fundamental currency of consciousness itself. Every word spoken in the service of explanation to deaf ears, every emotion expended in the futile attempt to make the blind see light they have no desire to perceive, every moment of attention leaked into the bottomless vessel of another's willful incomprehension. All of this represents not merely wasted effort, but the hemorrhaging of the very substance from which future possibilities are born. The woman awakening to her own high value, that mysterious quality that has nothing to do with external validation and everything to do with the integrated wholeness that comes from having descended into her own depths and emerged bearing the gold of self-knowledge, begins to feel within her being a shift as tectonic as the movement of continents. It is the recognition that her explanations have been drawn from a finite well, that her patience has been mined from reserves that require time and solitude to replenish, that her willingness to accommodate the limitations of others has been purchased with the very energy she needs for her own continued evolution. This is the moment of alchemy when the base metal of unconscious giving transforms into the gold of conscious offering. She sees with crystalline clarity how every justification demanded of her departure has been energy stolen from her arrival into whatever new landscape of possibility awaits her crossing. The time spent crafting explanations for those who have already demonstrated their inability to truly hear becomes time not spent in the creative solitude where her authentic self takes shape, where her gifts find their truest expression, where her soul's work can finally be born into the world without the distortion of others' projections and expectations. The archetype of the hermit rises within her consciousness, not the hermit of misanthropic withdrawal, but the hermit of sacred discernment, who understands that certain treasures can only be discovered in solitude, certain wisdoms can only be accessed in the absence of the crowd's clamoring voices. In the cave of her own contemplation, she begins to understand that her life force operates according to laws as immutable as those governing the physical universe. It cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transformed, and more importantly, it can be directed with the precision of a master alchemist toward its highest and most sacred purposes. This recognition arrives with the terrible clarity of lightning, illuminating a landscape previously shrouded in fog. She sees how her generous nature, untempered by the sword of discrimination, has created around her a field of energetic vampirism, not through any conscious malice on the part of others, but through the natural tendency of unconscious beings to draw sustenance from whatever source proves most readily available. Her willingness to explain herself endlessly, to justify her every feeling and decision, to translate the poetry of her inner life into prose that others could more easily consume, has established patterns of energetic exchange that drain rather than nourish her essential being. The dangerous power she now claims is dangerous precisely because it threatens the established order of relationships built upon her unconscious giving. When she begins to seal the vessel of her being, to preserve the precious elixir of her attention for those who have demonstrated their capacity to receive it as the sacred offering it truly is, the withdrawal creates a vacuum that forces everyone in her orbit to confront their own relationship to energy, responsibility, and authentic connection. In the alchemical tradition, the hermetically sealed vessel is essential for the work of transformation. Without proper containment, the volatile substances necessary for the creation of philosophical gold will simply evaporate into the surrounding atmosphere, leaving nothing but residue behind. The woman learning energetic sovereignty understands this principle in the depths of her being. She recognizes that her consciousness, her emotional availability, her creative life force must be contained and directed with the same precision that a master alchemist applies to the creation of the elixir of life. This is where Jung's understanding of the individuation process reveals its most radical implications. For the person committed to their own psychological and spiritual development, there comes a moment when the energy previously spent in endless accommodation of others' comfort must be withdrawn and redirected toward the inner work that authentic transformation requires. This is not selfishness, but self-responsibility, the recognition that she cannot give what she does not have, cannot offer from an empty well, cannot illumine others' darkness when her own inner light has been dimmed by the constant effort to make herself palatable to those who prefer their truth pre-digested. The sovereignty she claims extends beyond the mere right to leave without explanation into the deeper recognition that her presence itself is a gift not to be taken for granted. Every moment of genuine attention she offers, every authentic emotion she shares, every vulnerable truth she reveals, these represent investments of her finite conscious awareness, allocations of the irreplaceable currency of her lived experience. When these offerings are met with manipulation, weaponization, or simple unconscious consumption, the transaction violates the sacred economy of authentic relationship. In the myth of Psyche, the goddess Venus sets seemingly impossible tasks designed to exhaust the young woman's will to love, to prove her unworthiness through the very effort required to prove her worth. The woman awakening to energetic sovereignty recognizes this pattern in her own experience, how her willingness to explain herself has often been exploited as a form of psychological labor, a performance designed to exhaust her until she no longer has the energy to seek relationships that truly nourish her soul. The dangerous power of withdrawal reveals itself as dangerous not because it harms others, but because it illuminates the extent to which relationships have been built upon unacknowledged forms of energetic exploitation. When she stops over-explaining, over-accommodating, over-giving from the anxiety of being misunderstood, the true nature of many connections becomes visible. She sees which relationships were authentic mutual exchanges and which were elaborate systems of unconscious extraction disguised as intimacy. This recognition can be shattering, but it is the kind of destruction that serves creation, the breaking apart of false foundations so that something genuine can finally be built. The hermit archetype teaches that certain insights can only be gained in withdrawal from the collective noise. Certain strengths can only be developed in the gymnasium of solitude. Certain gifts can only be refined in the workshop of one's own contemplation. The alchemy of energetic sovereignty transforms her relationship to time itself. She begins to understand that time spent explaining herself to those who have no genuine interest in understanding is time stolen from her own becoming, consciousness diverted from its highest purposes into the futile task of making herself comprehensible to minds that have chosen incomprehension as their defense against growth. The woman who has learned to value her own time as sacred discovers that she has been treating it as a renewable resource when it is, in fact, the most finite gift she possesses. In the depths of this recognition, she begins to feel a quality of presence that is no longer fragmented by the effort to be understood by everyone. Her attention becomes like a laser rather than a flood lamp, focused, powerful, capable of illuminating depths that scattered energy could never reach. This concentrated presence becomes one of her greatest gifts, but it is a gift that can only be offered to those who have demonstrated their capacity to receive it without immediately seeking to dissipate its power through their own unconscious patterns. The dangerous power of energetic sovereignty reveals itself in the way it transforms not only her relationships, but her entire approach to living. She stops leaking consciousness through the countless micro-negotiations with others' comfort, the endless adjustments to others' expectations, the constant translation of her authentic self into versions others find less threatening. This reclaimed energy becomes available for the work that only she can do, the gifts that only she can offer, the unique contribution to the world's healing that requires the full intensity of her focused being. The vessel of her consciousness, properly sealed against unconscious dissipation, becomes a cauldron of transformation. The energy that was once scattered to the winds through compulsive explanation now concentrates into the kind of presence that can catalyze profound change in those ready for such encounter. But this catalytic power is selective. It responds only to genuine openness, authentic curiosity, real willingness to be changed by encounter with her truth. This selectivity is not elitism, but ecology, the recognition that different forms of consciousness create different environments and that certain kinds of growth can only occur in the presence of certain qualities of attention. The woman who has learned energetic sovereignty becomes like a rare orchid that blooms only under very specific conditions, offering its extraordinary beauty to those who have created the proper environment for its flourishing. The hermit's cave becomes a metaphor for the protected space within her own psyche where the most delicate and valuable aspects of her being can safely develop. In this inner sanctuary, she no longer needs to defend her choices, justify her feelings, or translate her experiences into forms others can easily digest. She can simply be, fully and authentically, allowing her true nature to unfold according to its own inner logic, rather than the external demands for comprehensibility. This protection of her inner space represents one of the most radical acts available to the individuating soul, the decision to prioritize inner authenticity over external approval, to choose the long path of genuine development over the short path of accommodating others' comfort. It is the choice to become who she really is rather than who others need her to be, to offer her authentic gifts rather than the performance of gifts she thinks others want to receive. The alchemy of this transformation touches every aspect of her existence. Her words become more potent because they are no longer diluted by the compulsive need to over-explain. Her silence becomes more meaningful because it is no longer the silence of suppression, but the silence of deep listening to her own inner wisdom. Her presence becomes more magnetic because it is no longer scattered across the impossible task of being everything to everyone. In claiming this dangerous power of energetic sovereignty, she discovers that she is not becoming harder but clearer, not more selfish but more genuinely generous, not less loving but finally able to love, in ways that honor both her own sacred nature and the authentic potential of those worthy of her deepest offerings. The hermit emerges from the cave, not as a misanthrope, but as one who has learned to distinguish between the fool's gold of surface connection and the true treasure of souls capable of real meeting. In the cathedral of her absence, they gather like moths around a flame that has already been extinguished, their voices rising in a chorus of bewilderment that echoes through chambers where her presence once brought light. Why did she leave without explanation? They ask, as if explanation were a debt she owed, as if the very asking did not reveal the profound unconsciousness that made her departure inevitable. Listen closely to the quality of their questioning, for in it lies the seed of their own answer. Those who demand explanation for her silence are unconsciously confessing their participation in the very dynamics that made silence her only sacred choice. They gather evidence of their innocence, while simultaneously demonstrating their guilt, not the guilt of deliberate cruelty, but the deeper guilt of willful unconsciousness, of choosing not to see what was always visible, of refusing to hear what was spoken in 1,000 different ways before words became unnecessary. The high-value woman, having crossed the threshold into conscious relationship with her own worth, recognizes this phenomenon with the clarity of one who has awakened from a dream. She sees that their frantic need for explanation stems not from genuine confusion, but from the ego's desperate attempt to maintain its carefully constructed narrative of innocence. They seek her words not to understand their role in her departure, but to find ways to absolve themselves of responsibility for what was left undone, unsaid, unloved. This is the mechanism of unconscious projection in its most revealing form, the externalization of internal knowing onto the very person who has withdrawn from their unconscious patterns. They project onto her silence their own abandoned responsibility, their own knowing of what they failed to offer, their own awareness of the emotional labor she carried while they remained passive recipients of her care. Her absence becomes a screen upon which they project their own shadows, seeing in her withdrawal the reflection of their own emotional unavailability. Jung understood this dynamic as fundamental to the unconscious psyche. We see in others what we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves. The person who demands explanation for abandonment is often the one who has been emotionally absent long before any physical departure occurred. The one who cries foul about being left without words is frequently the one who has been deaf to the language of needs, boundaries, and emotional truth that was spoken long before silence became the only remaining option. The high-value woman's silence becomes a mirror of perfect clarity, reflecting back to each person exactly what they have brought to the relationship. Those who brought genuine care and conscious attention feel sadness at her departure but understand its necessity. They may not agree with her choice, but they recognize her right to make it. They do not demand explanation because they were present enough to witness the 1,000 micro-departures that preceded her final withdrawal. But those who brought unconsciousness, who related to her as a function rather than a person, who expected her emotional availability without offering reciprocal investment, these are the ones who cry loudest about the injustice of her silence. They reveal themselves through their very complaints, demonstrating that even in her absence, they continue to relate to her as an object whose primary purpose is to serve their needs for comfort, clarity, and emotional regulation. Watch how they speak of her departure, and you will see the quality of consciousness they brought to her presence. Those who say, "I don't understand why she left," reveal that they were not paying attention to her emotional reality while she was present. Those who demand explanation reveal that they believe her inner world exists primarily to serve their need for comprehension. Those who feel entitled to her words reveal that they never understood the gift of her presence when it was freely given. This is the profound teaching embedded in the mirror of unconscious projection. We cannot receive what we do not recognize. The person who was unconscious of her value while she was present will be unconscious of the meaning of her absence. The one who could not see her gifts when they were offered will not understand their withdrawal. The unconscious mind cannot suddenly become conscious simply because the stakes have been raised. It can only become more desperately unconscious, more frantically projective. The high-value woman observes this phenomenon with compassion, born of her own journey through unconsciousness into awareness. She remembers her own times of projection, her own desperate need for others to explain their choices so she could avoid examining her own patterns. She understands that their demand for explanation is actually a plea for her to return to unconscious functioning, to resume the role of emotional caretaker who prioritizes their comfort over her own clarity. But consciousness, once achieved, cannot be voluntarily abandoned. She cannot unknow what she has learned about her own worth. She cannot unsee the patterns that she has recognized. She cannot unfeel the cost of over-functioning in relationships with people who mistake her care for their right. Her silence is not cruelty but conservation. the preservation of energy that was once scattered in futile attempts to wake people who were committed to remaining unconscious. In the space of her absence, some will use the mirror of her silence for genuine self-reflection. They will examine their own role in the relationship's end, not to flagellate themselves with guilt, but to develop the consciousness that could prevent such patterns from recurring. These individuals will transform the pain of her departure into the gold of self-awareness, using her absence as a teacher rather than an injustice. But others will use her silence to confirm their existing beliefs about themselves and relationships. They will gather testimony from others who affirm their innocence, collect evidence of their good intentions, build cases for why they deserved explanation, despite never offering the level of consciousness that would have made explanation unnecessary. They will remain unconscious by design, using her departure to strengthen rather than examine their defensive structures. The high-value woman understands that she cannot control which response her silence evokes. She cannot force consciousness on to those who are committed to unconsciousness. She cannot make people see what they are determined not to see. This understanding liberates her from the compulsive need to explain, educate, or illuminate. She recognizes that consciousness is an inside job, that awakening cannot be gifted or imposed, only invited and supported when the invitation is genuinely welcomed. Her silence becomes a boundary that protects her energy from being drained by unconscious projections. Instead of engaging with the frantic questioning, the demands for explanation, the attempts to drag her back into unconscious functioning, she maintains her position in conscious relationship to her own worth. She understands that engaging with unconscious projection only feeds it, that explaining herself to those who were not present enough to witness her experience while it was happening is like trying to describe color to someone who insists on keeping their eyes closed. This is the deeper teaching of the mirror. It reflects exactly what is brought before it, without distortion or interpretation. The high-value woman's silence serves the same function, creating a perfect reflection of the consciousness or unconsciousness that each person brought to their relationship with her. Those who see injustice in her departure are seeing the reflection of their own unconscious relating. Those who see necessity in her withdrawal are seeing the reflection of their own awareness of what genuine connection requires. The projection mechanism serves the unconscious ego's need to maintain its self-image without doing the work of genuine self-examination. By focusing on her behavior, her choices, her unfairness in leaving without explanation, they avoid looking at their own behavior, their own choices, their own fairness in expecting emotional labor without offering emotional investment. The projection allows them to remain victims of her cruelty rather than participants in their own unconscious patterns. But projection also serves a deeper function in the individuation process. It brings to consciousness through external drama what was previously hidden in the internal landscape. The person who is triggered by her silence is being offered information about their own relationship to abandonment, their own patterns of emotional unavailability, their own unconscious expectations about how others should serve their needs. The intensity of their reaction is proportional to the unconsciousness of their own patterns. Some will use this opportunity for growth, recognizing that their triggered response contains important information about their own psyche. They will explore why her silence feels so threatening, what it activates in their own abandonment wounds, how their reaction reveals their own patterns of unconscious relating. These individuals will transform the trigger into treasure, using her departure as a catalyst for their own awakening. Others will remain trapped in the projection, unable to retrieve their own shadow material from the screen of her absence. They will continue to see her as the problem, the one who acted wrongly, the person who owes them something that she has refused to give. They will remain unconscious by maintaining focus on her behavior rather than examining their own patterns, their own contributions to the dynamic that made her departure inevitable. The high-value woman recognizes that she cannot save people from their own unconsciousness, cannot force them to retrieve their projections, cannot make them see what they are determined not to see. This recognition is both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it means accepting that some people will remain trapped in unconscious patterns despite her care for them. Liberating because it frees her from the impossible task of awakening others against their will. Her silence becomes a gift to those ready to receive it, a mirror that reflects their own consciousness back to them with perfect clarity. For those committed to unconsciousness, it becomes a screen for their projections, allowing them to avoid the very self-examination that could transform their patterns. She cannot control which function her absence serves for each person, but she can maintain her own conscious relationship to the choice she has made. In the end, the mirror of unconscious projection reveals that her departure was not about them at all, despite their urgent need to make it about them. It was about her own relationship to consciousness, her own commitment to honoring her worth, her own choice to invest her energy in relationships that offer genuine reciprocity rather than unconscious extraction. Their reaction to her silence tells the story of their own unconsciousness, not the story of her failure to serve their needs. This is the profound teaching embedded in her withdrawal, that consciousness cannot be maintained in unconscious relationships without tremendous cost to the conscious person, that some people will use our presence to avoid examining their own patterns, and will use our absence to confirm their existing beliefs about relationships and responsibility, that the most loving thing we can sometimes do is refuse to participate in others' unconsciousness, even when that refusal is interpreted as abandonment rather than awakening. The high-value woman's silence serves consciousness itself, creating space for genuine self-reflection while refusing to enable unconscious patterns through over-explanation. She understands that some mirrors are too clouded by projection to reflect clearly, and that her energy is better invested in relationships where consciousness is welcomed rather than resisted, where her presence is valued rather than taken for granted, where explanation is unnecessary because awareness is already present. In her silence, she offers the world a teaching about the difference between conscious and unconscious relating, between genuine connection and unconscious extraction, between love that awakens and attachment that keeps us asleep. Those with eyes to see will understand the teaching. Those committed to unconsciousness will see only abandonment, never recognizing that they abandoned her long before she departed, never understanding that her silence is the echo of their own emotional absence, the mirror of their own unconscious patterns, reflected back with perfect, unforgiving clarity. In the crucible of her conscious relationship to her own energy, she discovers what the ancient mystics knew, that attention is the currency of the soul, more precious than gold, more powerful than words, more sacred than any material offering. Through the fire of awakening to her own worth, she begins to understand the sacred economy that governs all authentic connection, an economy so different from the unconscious marketplace of human relationship that it appears to those still trapped in scarcity thinking as cruelty disguised as wisdom. But this is not cruelty. This is consciousness applied to the most fundamental question of human existence. Where do we invest the finite resource of our life force? The high-value woman has learned, through the costly education of overgiving, that attention, true, present, conscious attention, is the most valuable gift one being can offer another. It is the essence of love made manifest, the bridge between souls, the light by which We truly see and are seen. Yet in the unconscious economy that governs most human relationships, attention has been devalued, treated as an unlimited resource that should flow freely toward anyone who demands it. In this distorted marketplace, explanation becomes a debt rather than a gift. Presence becomes an expectation rather than a blessing, and the conscious person's energy becomes common property rather than sacred treasure. The awakened woman recognizes this distortion with the clarity of one who has been educated by her own exhaustion. She has given explanation to those who used her words as weapons against her boundaries. She has offered presence to those who consumed her energy without gratitude or reciprocity. She has invested attention in relationships where consciousness was not welcomed, where her insights were dismissed, where her emotional labor was expected rather than honored. Through this costly education, she discovers the fundamental principle of the sacred economy, that genuine connection requires conscious reciprocity, that healthy relationships operate on the principle of energetic exchange rather than energetic extraction. She learns to distinguish between those who receive her attention as a gift and those who consume it as a right, between relationships that nourish and those that deplete, between connections that honor consciousness and those that demand unconsciousness as the price of acceptance. This distinction is not born of ego or superiority, but of profound self-respect and spiritual discernment. The high-value woman understands that her attention, her presence, her words carry power, the power to heal or harm, to awaken or enable, to nourish consciousness or feed unconscious patterns. With this understanding comes the recognition that she has not just the right, but the responsibility to be conscious about where this power is directed. In the sacred economy, explanation becomes an investment that requires assessment of the recipient's capacity to receive and utilize the gift wisely. The conscious woman asks herself, will my words land in fertile soil or fall on rocky ground? Will my explanation be used for genuine understanding or for gathering ammunition against my boundaries? Will this person use my vulnerability as a bridge to greater consciousness or as a tool to manipulate my return to unconscious functioning? These are not cynical calculations but sacred discernments. They arise from understanding that consciousness itself is precious and must be protected from those who would use it against itself. The awakened woman has learned that some people demand explanation not because they genuinely seek understanding, but because they seek control. Control over her choices, her energy, her consciousness itself. She operates now from abundance rather than scarcity, understanding that withholding explanation from those who have devalued her presence is not withholding love, but practicing discriminate love, love that honors both herself and the genuine seeker by refusing to cast pearls before those who would trample them underfoot. This is love that has learned to love consciously, love that has evolved beyond the compulsive giving that characterizes unconscious relating. In the sacred economy, energy flows toward consciousness and away from unconsciousness, toward reciprocity and away from extraction, toward those who value presence and away from those who consume it without gratitude. This is not punishment but natural law, the law that governs all sustainable systems, the principle that ensures life force flows toward life rather than toward that which would drain and diminish it. The high-value woman recognizes that her previous pattern of over-explaining was actually a form of spiritual bypassing, an attempt to avoid the discomfort of disappointing others by sacrificing her own energetic boundaries. She gave explanation not because it served consciousness, but because it served her own need to be seen as good, understanding, available. She offered her energy compulsively rather than consciously, driven by conditioning rather than choice. But consciousness, once achieved, reveals the cost of unconscious giving. She sees how her indiscriminate explanations actually enabled others' unconscious patterns, how her availability without boundaries taught others to devalue her presence, how her compulsive caretaking prevented others from developing their own emotional resources. She understands that her overfunctioning was not love, but a form of unconscious control, an attempt to manage others' responses to her choices. In the sacred economy, love flows naturally toward consciousness, and naturally away from unconsciousness. This is not a moral judgment, but an energetic reality. Consciousness recognizes and attracts consciousness. Unconsciousness consumes and repels it. The awakened woman aligns herself with this natural flow rather than fighting against it, allowing her energy to move toward relationships that welcome and nourish it. This alignment requires tremendous courage because it means disappointing those who have grown accustomed to her unconscious availability. It means accepting that some people will interpret her boundaries as abandonment, her discernment as cruelty, her consciousness as selfishness. The scared ego within her whispers warnings about being misunderstood, rejected, condemned for her refusal to continue unconscious patterns. But the self, the deeper center of her being, knows differently. The self understands that true love sometimes requires the courage to disappoint others' unconscious expectations in service of consciousness itself. The self recognizes that her energy is sacred and must be stewarded consciously, that her attention is precious and must be invested wisely, that her presence is a gift that must be offered to those who can receive it as such. In this sacred economy, the high-value woman discovers a paradox that transforms her understanding of relationship itself. The less available she becomes to unconscious demands, the more available she becomes for conscious connection. By protecting her energy from those who would consume it unconsciously, she preserves it for those who would receive it consciously. By refusing to explain herself to those who use her words against her boundaries, she creates space for authentic dialogue with those who honor her truth. This is abundance thinking applied to relationships, the understanding that energy consciously preserved and wisely invested multiplies and expands, while energy unconsciously scattered and indiscriminately given depletes and diminishes. The awakened woman chooses multiplication over depletion, conscious investment over unconscious dissipation. She learns to recognize the signs of those who operate in the sacred economy. They do not demand explanation but seek understanding. They do not consume her energy but exchange with it. They do not expect her availability but appreciate her presence. They do not use her words against her boundaries but honor her truth, even when it disappoints them. These rare souls understand that consciousness is precious and must be met with consciousness, that attention is sacred and must be received with gratitude, that explanation is a gift that must be worthy of the offering. With these conscious beings, she discovers the joy of energetic reciprocity, the dance of mutual nourishment where both parties are fed by the exchange, where consciousness begets consciousness, where presence amplifies presence. In these relationships, explanation flows naturally because it is welcomed rather than demanded, received as gift rather than expected as debt. But with those who operate from unconscious extraction, she maintains her boundaries with the firmness of one who has learned the cost of unconscious giving. She does not explain her boundaries to those who have demonstrated their inability to respect them. She does not offer her energy to those who have shown they will consume it without reciprocity. She does not cast the pearls of her consciousness before those who have proven they will trample them. This is not withholding love, but directing love consciously. It is love that has learned to love wisely, love that honors both the giver and the receiver, by refusing to participate in unconscious patterns that serve no one's highest good. It is love that has evolved beyond compulsion into choice. beyond reaction into response, beyond unconscious availability into conscious presence. The sacred economy teaches that every moment of attention, every word of explanation, every gesture of presence is an investment in consciousness itself. The awakened woman chooses her investments wisely, understanding that consciousness supported grows stronger while consciousness scattered among the unconscious grows weaker. She aligns herself with the natural law that governs all sustainable systems. Energy flows toward that which nourishes it and away from that which depletes it. In her conscious relationship to her own energy, she discovers that true abundance comes not from giving everything to everyone, but from giving consciously to those who can receive consciously. She learns that the most loving thing she can do is preserve her consciousness so that it can serve consciousness, protect her energy so that it can nourish those who honor it, maintain her boundaries so that her presence remains a gift rather than becoming an expectation. This is the sacred economy in action. Attention as currency, consciousness as treasure, explanation as investment rather than obligation. The high-value woman operates from this understanding, offering her precious life force to those who recognize its value while protecting it from those who would consume it unconsciously. In this way, she serves not only her own awakening, but the awakening of all those who encounter her conscious presence, teaching by example what it means to love both consciously and courageously. In the silence of her departure lies a medicine so potent that it threatens to shake the very foundations of how we have been conditioned to understand love, relationship, and the feminine essence itself. Her wordless withdrawal carries within it the healing balm for a wound so ancient, so pervasive, so deeply embedded in our collective psyche that most cannot even see its presence. The wound of overfunctioning that has been passed down through generations of women like a cursed inheritance, disguised as virtue and celebrated as love. Listen to the whispers of the ancestors, the ghostly voices of grandmothers and great-grandmothers who died with their own needs unspoken, their own dreams abandoned on the altar of others' comfort. Feel the weight of centuries pressing down through the genetic memory, the learned helplessness of fathers who were taught that emotional labor belongs to women, the conditioning of mothers who sacrificed their life force to maintain relationships with those who refused to meet them halfway. This is the collective wound she carries, not just her own pain, but the accumulated anguish of countless women who overfunctioned themselves into exhaustion while calling it love. The high-value woman's silent departure is not merely personal choice, but archetypal rebellion. In walking away without explanation, she breaks a chain that has bound the feminine for generations, the chain that says women are responsible for managing others' emotions, for maintaining the peace at the cost of their own truth, for carrying the emotional labor of connection while others remain passive recipients of their care. Her silence becomes a revolutionary act disguised as withdrawal, a declaration of independence dressed as abandonment. But revolution is never comfortable for those who benefit from the systems being overthrown. Her departure threatens the unconscious agreements that have governed relationship for generations, agreements that she will carry what others refuse to carry, that she will give what others refuse to reciprocate, that she will explain what should be obvious to anyone paying attention to her humanity. These unconscious contracts were written in the invisible ink of conditioning, signed in the blood of women who learned too late the cost of loving without boundaries. The collective wound of over-functioning manifests in 1,000 subtle ways. The woman who manages her partner's schedule while neglecting her own needs. The daughter who becomes her parent's emotional caretaker while her brothers remain free from such expectations. The friend who always initiates contact, always plans gatherings, always tends to the maintenance of connection while others simply show up to receive. It appears in the mother who sacrifices her dreams so completely that she forgets she ever had them, in the employee who works twice as hard for half the recognition, in the lover who gives her body and heart to someone who offers only convenience in return. This wound runs so deep that most women cannot even name it, cannot recognize the pattern that shapes their lives like water carving canyons through stone. They have been conditioned to see their over-functioning as love, their emotional labor as natural feminine expression, their exhaustion as evidence of their caring nature. They have been taught to measure their worth by how much they give rather than how consciously they give, to find identity in their usefulness rather than their essence. But the high-value woman has awakened from this collective trance. Through the painful recognition of her own patterns, she has seen the wound clearly, not as personal failing but as collective conditioning, not as individual pathology but as systemic dysfunction that masquerades as natural order. She understands that her over-functioning was never truly about love, but about the desperate attempt to earn love through usefulness, to secure connection through indispensability, to find worth through service to others at the expense of service to herself. In her silence, she refuses to continue this ancient pattern. She will not chase those who have grown comfortable with her pursuit. She will not explain herself to those who have never learned to truly listen. She will not carry the emotional weight of relationships with those who refuse to develop their own emotional muscles. Her departure becomes a teaching, not just for those she leaves behind, but for the collective feminine consciousness that watches through her eyes, learns through her choices, heals through her courageous refusal to perpetuate unconscious patterns. This is rebellion at its most profound level, not the loud rebellion of anger and accusation, but the quiet rebellion of sovereign choice. She rebels against the expectation that she will sacrifice her life force to maintain others' comfort. She rebels against the assumption that explanation is owed to those who were not present enough to witness her experience. She rebels against the collective agreement that women's energy should flow freely toward anyone who demands it, regardless of reciprocity or consciousness. Her rebellion is dressed as silence, but those with eyes to see recognize its true nature. This is the feminine reclaiming her power, not through domination but through discrimination, not through aggression but through conscious withdrawal of energy from unconscious patterns. She is teaching a new way of being in relationship, modeling what it looks like when the feminine refuses to overfunction, when love becomes conscious rather than compulsive. The wound of overfunctioning has created a world where emotional labor is gendered, where women are expected to be the relationship experts while men remain emotionally adolescent, where the feminine carries the burden of connection while the masculine benefits from her efforts without reciprocal investment. This unconscious division of emotional labor has created relationships where women give their life force away in service of maintaining connections with people who mistake their devotion for desperate need rather than generous gift. But in her silence, the high-value woman breaks this pattern. She demonstrates that emotional labor, like all labor, must be valued and reciprocated. She shows that connection maintained by one person is not connection but extraction. She reveals that relationships requiring constant explanation and emotional caretaking from one party are not relationships but dependencies dressed as love. Her departure becomes a mirror for the collective, reflecting back the cost of unconscious relating, the price of taking women's emotional labor for granted, the consequence of expecting the feminine to carry what belongs to both parties. In her absence, some will finally recognize what they lost, not just her presence, but her endless capacity to bridge the gap between their unconsciousness and genuine connection. The healing she offers is not comfortable. Like all powerful medicine, it tastes bitter before it brings relief. Her silence forces those left behind to develop their own emotional resources, to take responsibility for their own growth, to learn the skills of conscious relating that they allowed her to carry for them. Some will rise to this challenge, using her departure as a catalyst for their own awakening. Others will simply seek another woman willing to overfunction, perpetuating the cycle while missing the teaching entirely. This is the paradox of healing the collective wound. It requires individual women to stop participating in unconscious patterns, even when stopping means disappointing those who have grown comfortable with their overfunctioning. Each woman who chooses consciousness over compulsion, boundaries over availability, discernment over indiscriminate giving, heals not just her own lineage, but contributes to the healing of the collective feminine wound. The high-value woman understands that her silence serves something larger than her personal relationships. It serves the evolution of consciousness itself, the healing of ancient patterns that have kept both men and women trapped in unconscious roles. By refusing to overfunction, she creates space for others to develop their own capacity for emotional labor. By withdrawing her compulsive caretaking, she offers others the opportunity to grow into conscious participants rather than passive recipients. But this growth is not guaranteed. Some will interpret her boundaries as cruelty, her consciousness as selfishness, her refusal to overfunction as abandonment. They will seek to guilt her back into unconscious patterns, to shame her for choosing her own well-being over their comfort. They will call her selfish for refusing to sacrifice herself on the altar of their unconscious needs. Yet she holds steady in her knowing that healing requires disruption, that consciousness demands the dismantling of unconscious patterns, that love sometimes looks like disappointing others' expectations in service of truth itself. She understands that the collective wound cannot be healed by perpetuating it, that women's liberation requires women to stop liberating others at the cost of their own freedom. Her silence becomes a teaching story that ripples through the collective consciousness, the story of a woman who loved herself enough to stop overfunctioning, who valued her energy enough to invest it consciously, who honored her worth enough to walk away from those who could not meet her halfway. This story carries medicine for other women who recognize themselves in her journey, who see in her courage the permission to examine their own patterns of overfunctioning. The collective wound runs deep, carved by generations of conditioning that taught women to measure their worth through service, to find identity in usefulness, to seek love through indispensability. But consciousness, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. Each woman who chooses conscious relating over compulsive giving contributes to the healing of this ancient wound. In her departure without explanation, the high-value woman models a new way of being feminine, one that honors the sacred nature of emotional labor, that demands reciprocity in relationship, that refuses to carry what belongs to others. She demonstrates that true love sometimes requires the courage to stop loving unconsciously, to cease enabling others' unconscious patterns through her own over-functioning. This is evolution disguised as abandonment, transformation dressed as withdrawal. Her silence serves the collective healing, offering medicine to a wound so old that most mistake it for natural feminine expression. Through her conscious refusal to perpetuate unconscious patterns, she helps birth a new way of relating, one where emotional labor is shared, where connection requires participation from all parties, where love flows consciously rather than compulsively. The ancestors who overfunctioned themselves into exhaustion can finally rest, their burden lifted by daughters and granddaughters who have learned to love without losing themselves. The wound that passed through generations begins to heal, not through more of the same unconscious giving, but through conscious women who refuse to sacrifice their life force to maintain relationships with those who will not meet them halfway. Her silent departure becomes a prayer for the collective feminine, a prayer that women will remember their worth, reclaim their power, and choose conscious love over compulsive caretaking. It becomes a blessing for future generations who will inherit not the wound of overfunctioning, but the wisdom of conscious relating, not the pattern of emotional labor without reciprocity, but the model of love that honors both giver and receiver. In her silence, she breaks the chain. In her departure, she ends the cycle. In her conscious refusal to overfunction, she offers healing medicine to a collective wound that has been mistaken for love itself. This is her gift to the world, not her words, but her witness to what it looks like when a woman chooses consciousness over conditioning, sovereignty over service, conscious love over compulsive giving. There comes a moment in the journey of awakening when the chrysalis of justification finally splits open, and what emerges is not the familiar butterfly of explanation, but something far more ancient and powerful. The warrior goddess who has learned that her sword is forged not from words, but from the sacred metal of silence itself. She stands now at the threshold between her former self and this new incarnation, feeling the weight of 1,000 explanations falling away like discarded armor that no longer fits her expanding spirit. The maiden who once bent herself into pretzels of reasoning, who crafted elaborate justifications for her every breath and movement, has been transformed through the alchemical fires of experience into something altogether different, a woman who understands that the most powerful boundaries are drawn not with ink, but with the clean, sharp edge of deliberate action. In the beginning, she was taught that her worth was measured by her ability to make others comfortable with her choices. She learned to wrap her decisions in soft packages of explanation, to cushion her boundaries with lengthy dissertations on why she needed them, to apologize for taking up space while simultaneously defending her right to exist within it. She became a masterful architect of justification, building elaborate structures of reasoning around the simple truth that she had the right to choose her own path. But the universe, in its infinite wisdom and occasional cruelty, continued to send her teachers disguised as challengers, those who would push against every boundary she erected, not because they couldn't understand her explanations, but because they had learned that explanations could be negotiated, reasoned away, worn down through persistence and manipulation. They sensed that beneath her careful words lay a woman who still believed she needed permission to honor her own instincts, who still thought that love meant sacrificing her sovereignty on the altar of others' comfort. Through countless cycles of explanation and violation, justification and dismissal, she began to recognize the futile nature of her approach. Like a gardener who realizes that some weeds cannot be reasoned with, but must simply be removed at the root, she understood that certain boundaries require the clean precision of action, rather than the complex choreography of words. The breakthrough came not through more sophisticated arguments, but through the profound recognition that she was engaging in a game where the rules had been rigged against her from the beginning. The transformation began in the sacred space of her inner sanctum, where she encountered the archetypal warrior goddess who had been waiting patiently within her psyche for this moment of recognition. This inner figure bore no resemblance to the aggressive, masculine warrior that society often celebrates, but was instead the embodiment of feminine power in its most refined form. A presence that moved with the deliberate grace of a lioness protecting her cubs, the unwavering focus of a surgeon making life-saving cuts, the terrible beauty of a storm system that reshapes landscapes through pure, purposeful force. This warrior goddess whispered ancient truths into her awakening consciousness. Child of my heart, you have been wielding your sword backwards, using its handle to explain while leaving its blade dull with disuse. The time has come to remember that some battles are won not through superior argument, but through the courage to walk away from fights that were never yours to engage in. The warrior goddess taught her about the sacred art of strategic withdrawal, not the retreat of defeat, but the tactical movement of one who has assessed the battlefield and recognized that some territories are not worth defending because they were never truly under attack. She learned to distinguish between genuine misunderstanding, which could be resolved through patient explanation, and deliberate obtuseness, which used her willingness to explain as a weapon against her own boundaries. In this new understanding, her silence became a living thing, not the empty absence of sound, but a presence as substantial and meaningful as any spoken word. It was the silence of deep waters that reveal their depths only to those worthy of the dive, the silence of ancient mountains that have watched civilizations rise and fall without feeling compelled to comment on each passing season. Her silence carried within it the accumulated wisdom of every explanation that had fallen on deliberately deaf ears, every justification that had been twisted into ammunition for further assault. She discovered that this silence possessed a quality that her words had never achieved. It was unassailable. No one could argue with her absence, negotiate with her withdrawal, or manipulate her into reconsidering boundaries that were enforced through action rather than explanation. Her silence created clean, inviolable space around her authentic self, like a force field generated not through technology, but through the sheer power of a woman who had finally learned to trust her own instincts without requiring external validation. The warrior goddess within her understood something that the explaining maiden had never grasped, that the people truly worthy of her presence possessed the emotional intelligence and respect to understand her absence without requiring a detailed map of her decision-making process. Those who demanded explanations for her boundaries were often the very people from whom she needed to be protected. Their insistence on understanding was frequently a thinly veiled demand for the ammunition necessary to dismantle her defenses. This realization brought with it both liberation and grief. Liberation because she finally understood that she had been holding herself responsible for managing other people's emotional reactions to her autonomy. Grief because she recognized how much of her life force had been drained through the futile attempt to make everyone comfortable with her right to exist as she chose. She mourned the countless hours spent crafting explanations for people who had no genuine interest in understanding, only in finding weak points in her reasoning where they could insert the crowbar of their own agenda. The warrior goddess taught her to recognize the difference between those who questioned her boundaries out of love and concern, seeking to understand so they could better support her journey, and those who questioned her boundaries as a preliminary step to violating them. The former approached with curiosity and respect, ready to accept her explanation or her silence with equal grace. The latter approached like vultures circling a wounded animal, seeking to exploit any perceived weakness in her resolve. As she embraced this new archetype within herself, she began to move through the world with a different energy. Gone was the hunched, defensive posture of someone perpetually braced for attack and armed with justifications. In its place emerged the upright bearing of a woman who knew her own worth and felt no compulsion to prove it through endless explanation. Her presence itself became a boundary, clear, unmistakable, and enforced through the simple but profound act of honoring her own instincts without apology. The transformation was not without its challenges. Those who had become accustomed to her explanations reacted with confusion, anger, and sometimes desperate attempts to provoke her back into the familiar role of the justifying maiden. They missed the predictable dance where their challenges would be met with elaborate explanations they could then pick apart and use against her. Her new silence left them with nothing to grab onto, no handholds for their manipulative climbing. Some relationships, she discovered, had been built entirely on her willingness to over-explain and over-justify. When she withdrew this support, these connections collapsed like houses built on shifting sand, revealing that they had never been founded on genuine love or respect, but on her willingness to continuously earn her place through emotional labor and self-diminishment. The loss was painful but ultimately liberating, clearing space in her life for relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided explanation. The warrior goddess within her celebrated each boundary that was honored through silence rather than speech, each relationship that survived her transition from explaining maiden to sovereign woman, each moment when she chose action over words and found that her worth remained intact, without the constant buttressing of justification. She learned that the people who truly belonged in her life would adapt to her evolution with grace, while those who belonged to earlier chapters of her story would naturally fall away. Her silence became a teacher for others as well, particularly for women who recognized in her transformation the permission they had been seeking to honor their own boundaries, without endless explanation. She became living proof that a woman could choose her battles wisely, could withdraw from unwinnable fights without surrendering her power, could protect her energy by refusing to cast pearls before swine. The warrior goddess archetype brought with it an understanding of strategic thinking that the explaining maiden had lacked. Where once she had approached every boundary violation as an opportunity for education and enlightenment, she now recognized that some people were not interested in learning but in conquering. Her energy became precious, finite resource to be invested wisely rather than scattered like seeds on concrete. This transformation rippled outward into every area of her life. In professional settings, she stopped over-justifying her decisions and instead communicated them with the quiet confidence of someone who had done her due diligence and needed no external validation. In romantic relationships, she began to trust that a man worthy of her love would respect her boundaries without requiring detailed explanations for why they existed. In friendships, she learned to let go of those who demanded constant justification for her choices while drawing closer to those who supported her sovereignty. The warrior goddess taught her about the power of mystique, not the artificial mystery of game playing, but the natural reserve of a woman who understood that not every thought needed to be shared, not every decision needed to be explained, not every feeling needed to be justified. Her inner life became a sacred space that she guarded carefully, sharing its treasures only with those who had proven themselves worthy through consistent respect and understanding. She discovered that her silence could be more compelling than her words had ever been. Where her explanations had often fallen on deaf ears, her absence spoke volumes. Where her justifications had been picked apart and dismissed, her withdrawal could not be argued with or negotiated away. She had finally learned to speak the only language that manipulators and boundary violators truly understood, the language of consequences delivered through action rather than words. The warrior goddess within her understood something profound about feminine power, that it was not meant to be displayed and explained like a museum exhibit, but embodied and expressed through deliberate choice and unwavering action. The most powerful women throughout history had been those who moved with quiet certainty, who knew their own minds and trusted their own instincts, who understood that true strength was often demonstrated through what one chose not to do, rather than what one chose to explain. As this chapter of her journey drew to a close, she stood transformed, no longer the maiden who sought approval through explanation, but the warrior goddess who commanded respect through the simple but revolutionary act of honoring her own truth without apology. Her silence had become her sword, her boundaries her armor, and her action her shield. She had learned that the most profound victories were often achieved not through superior argument, but through the courage to withdraw from battles that diminished rather than elevated her spirit. The warrior goddess whispered one final truth as this phase of transformation crystallized. Remember, daughter of my lineage, that those who are meant to walk alongside you will understand your silence as clearly as your speech. Those who demand explanations for your autonomy reveal themselves as unworthy of the very thing they seek to understand. Your silence is not empty space to be filled with justification, but sacred territory to be protected with the fierce love of a mother defending her child. Guard it well, for within that silence lies the seed of your ultimate freedom. In the depths of her transformation, she encounters an ancient truth that has been buried beneath centuries of conditioning, the recognition that her right to mysterious departure is not a privilege to be earned, but a birthright to be reclaimed. Like a woman remembering a forgotten language that once flowed from her lips as naturally as breath, she reconnects with the archetypal feminine that moves with the fluid intelligence of water itself, finding its way around obstacles rather than exhausting itself in futile attempts to erode them through endless explanation. The breakthrough comes not as a thunderbolt of revelation, but as the gentle, dawning recognition that she has been swimming against currents that were never meant to be conquered, only navigated. For too long she had believed that her feminine nature required her to be perpetually available for interrogation, constantly ready to defend her choices with detailed maps of her inner landscape. But now, standing in the sacred space of her reclaimed autonomy, she understands that the most profound feminine wisdom lies not in revelation, but in the conscious cultivation of mystery. This mystery is not the manipulative withholding of the game player, nor the fearful hiding of the wounded child, but something far more ancient and powerful, the natural reserve of a woman who understands that her inner depths are an ocean, not a puddle, and that true intimacy is not granted through detailed explanation, but earned through consistent respect and demonstrated worthiness. She recognizes that she has been living in a world that demanded she turn herself inside out, like a garment to be examined, when her true nature calls her to move like the moon through its phases, revealing and concealing in perfect rhythm with her own internal seasons. The archetype of the mysterious feminine that awakens within her carries the wisdom of countless generations of women who understood that power often lies not in what is shown, but in what is preserved. These ancestral voices whisper to her of a time when feminine mystery was recognized as sacred, when a woman's right to privacy was understood as essential to her power, when the depth of her silence was valued as highly as the beauty of her speech. She begins to understand that her previous compulsion to explain everything had been a form of spiritual bulimia, a desperate attempt to empty herself of all content so that others might find her digestible, manageable, controllable. But the mysterious feminine within her rebels against this self-diminishment, calling her back to the ancient understanding that a woman's inner life is her sanctuary, and sanctuaries are not meant to be public spaces where every passerby can demand a guided tour. This reclamation of mystery transforms her relationship with silence from something she fears, the dreaded space where others might project their assumptions, into something she treasures as a source of power. Her silence becomes like the ocean's depth, holding within its darkness treasures that reveal themselves only to those willing to dive deep enough to discover them. She learns that silence is not empty space requiring justification, but full space containing possibilities that words would only diminish. The mysterious feminine teaches her about the art of strategic revelation, the understanding that not every question deserves an answer, Not every curiosity merits satisfaction. Not every demand for explanation warrants response. She begins to move through interactions like a master artist, revealing a painting, knowing instinctively which details to share and which to keep hidden, understanding that the spaces between the brushstrokes are as important as the strokes themselves. This transformation ripples through her relationships like rings on still water. Those who had become accustomed to her oversharing find themselves disoriented by her new selectivity, unsure how to relate to a woman who no longer spills her inner contents at the slightest pressure. Some react with increased demands for information, like children testing a boundary to see if it will hold. Others, those with deeper wisdom, recognize the emergence of something precious and adjust their approach accordingly, understanding that they are now in the presence of a woman who has remembered her own worth. She discovers that her mysterious departure, her ability to leave situations, relationships, and conversations without providing detailed exit interviews, carries within it the same natural authority as the changing seasons. Just as autumn does not pause to explain to summer why its time has ended, just as winter does not justify its arrival to those who preferred the warmth, she learns to trust the organic timing of her own cycles without feeling compelled to provide commentary on each transition. The mysterious feminine within her understands something that her explaining self never could, that the most profound communications often happen in the spaces between words, in the pregnant pauses that allow truth to emerge, in the silence that creates room for others to hear their own inner voice, rather than being overwhelmed by the constant noise of her justifications. She begins to trust that those who are meant to understand her will do so without requiring detailed maps of her inner territory. This trust extends to her relationship with time itself, where once she felt pressured to respond immediately to every question, to provide instant explanations for every choice, she now moves with the deliberate pace of natural forces. Like the moon that takes its own time to wax and wane, she allows her responses to emerge from their own organic timing rather than the artificial urgency imposed by others' impatience. She recognizes that her previous over-explaining had been a form of spiritual poverty, a belief that she had so little inherent value that she needed to constantly prove her worth through detailed justifications. But the mysterious feminine within her carries a different understanding, one that recognizes her inherent worth as self-evident, requiring no external validation or explanation. She begins to move through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that her value is not determined by others' understanding of it. The transformation brings with it a new relationship with conflict. Where once she would have met every challenge with elaborate explanations, attempting to think her way out of emotional confrontations, she now understands that some conflicts are not meant to be resolved through words, but transcended through action. Her mysterious departure becomes a form of Aikido, using the energy of aggression against itself by refusing to provide the resistance that conflict requires to sustain itself. She learns to recognize the difference between those who question her boundaries out of genuine care and those who probe for weaknesses they can exploit. The former approach her mystery with respect, understanding that depths are revealed gradually through trust, not excavated through interrogation. The latter reveal themselves through their frustration with her newfound selectivity, their anger at encountering a woman who can no longer be manipulated through guilt or pressure. The mysterious feminine teaches her about the power of cyclical nature, understanding that just as the ocean has tides, her availability to others naturally ebbs and flows. She no longer feels guilty about the times when she needs to withdraw into herself. recognizing these periods not as antisocial behavior requiring apology, but as necessary seasons of her inner life that allow for regeneration and renewal. This cyclical understanding extends to her relationships, where she begins to recognize that some connections are meant to be seasonal rather than permanent. Just as trees don't apologize when they shed their leaves, she learns to allow relationships to end naturally when their season has passed, without feeling compelled to provide detailed analysis of why the connection no longer serves her growth. The archetype of the mysterious feminine brings with it an understanding of non-linear communication, the recognition that truth often emerges not through direct explanation but through symbol, metaphor, and the spaces between words. She begins to trust her own intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent, when to reveal and when to conceal, when to engage and when to withdraw. She discovers that her mystery creates a magnetic field around her, drawing to her those who are intrigued by depth rather than threatened by it. The people who remain in her life after this transformation are those who appreciate complexity, who understand that the most interesting conversations happen not when everything is explained, but when space is left for imagination and interpretation. The mysterious feminine within her carries the wisdom of the ancient oracles who understood that the most powerful truths are often delivered not as clear pronouncements, but as riddles that require the seeker to do their own inner work to understand. She begins to trust that those who are meant to comprehend her will do the necessary work to bridge the spaces she leaves unfilled, while those who demand everything be spelled out for them reveal their lack of readiness for genuine intimacy. This transformation culminates in the recognition that her right to mystery is not selfish withholding but generous boundary setting, that by maintaining her depths, she creates space for others to discover their own. Her silence becomes a gift that allows others to fill the space with their own projections and, in doing so, learn something about themselves. Her mysterious departure becomes a teaching that demonstrates the possibility of choosing oneself without needing to destroy others in the process. In the most ancient chambers of the collective unconscious, where the primordial feminine dwells in her full mystery and power, there exists a knowing that transcends the desperate need to be understood, a wisdom as old as the first woman who recognized that her depth could not be contained within the narrow vessels of others' comprehension. This is the moment of profound liberation, when she reclaims her birthright as mystery incarnate, when she remembers that the feminine principle has always moved like water, not because it lacks the power to break stone, but because it possesses the infinitely greater power to flow around obstacles to find its own level, to carve new channels through the landscape of existence without announcing its intentions to those who would seek to dam its course. The archetypal feminine that awakens within her consciousness is not the domesticated version that patriarchal structures have attempted to create, the feminine that explains itself endlessly, that justifies its every mood and movement, that translates its mysterious ways into the linear language of masculine understanding. No, this is the wild feminine, the untamed goddess who moves according to the deep currents of her own being, who changes like the phases of the moon without feeling compelled to provide a meteorological report to those who prefer the static predictability of artificial light. As she steps into this liberation, she feels within her being the stirring of powers that have been dormant for too long, the ability to be completely present and utterly elusive simultaneously, to offer the gift of her being while maintaining the sacred privacy of her depths, to love deeply while remaining fundamentally unknowable to those who approach her mystery with the crude instruments of analytical dissection. This is the feminine that drove men to write poetry rather than demand explanations, that inspired reverence rather than the entitled expectation of transparency. The ocean does not explain its tides to the shore it caresses and abandons in endless cycles. It simply moves according to the ancient conversation between moon and water, a dialogue conducted in languages older than words, more profound than any explanation could ever be. The woman reclaiming her mysterious nature understands that her emotional tides, her inner seasons, her deep currents of feeling and knowing operate according to similar cosmic laws, rhythms that cannot be reduced to cause and effect, patterns that emerge from the intersection of soul and circumstance in ways that transcend the demand for rational accounting. In this reclamation, she discovers that her silence carries a power that her explanations never could. When she stops trying to make herself comprehensible to those who lack the sensitivity to read the subtle languages of her being, her very presence becomes a revelation. Like the moon that illuminates the night sky without speaking, her mystery becomes a source of light for those who have learned to see in the darkness, while remaining invisible to those who insist on the harsh fluorescence of demanded disclosure. The liberation she experiences is not the freedom from connection, but the freedom to connect authentically, from her depths rather than from her surface accommodations, from her truth rather than from her performance of what others want her truth to be. She understands now that the relationships worth having are those that can hold space for her mystery without needing to solve it, that can appreciate the gift of her presence without demanding the violation of her privacy, that can love her wholeness without requiring access to every corner of her inner landscape. This ancient feminine wisdom recognizes that explanation often destroys the very thing it seeks to convey. When the rose explains its beauty, it ceases to be beautiful and becomes merely botanical information. When the storm justifies its fury, it loses the terrible majesty that commands respect without negotiation. When the woman of depth translates her mystery into the crude language of justification, she sacrifices the very quality that makes her worth knowing, her essential unknowability, her capacity to surprise, her depth that cannot be mapped by casual exploration. The water archetype that flows through her consciousness teaches her about the power of adaptation without capitulation. Water takes the shape of any container, but it never becomes the container. It yields to every obstacle, but it never stops moving toward its destination. It can be temporarily dammed, but it always finds a way to continue its journey, carving new channels when the old ones are blocked, flowing underground when the surface path is obstructed, gathering force in hidden places until it emerges with renewed power. As she embodies this water-like wisdom, she learns to flow around the obstacles of others' incomprehension, rather than exhausting herself, trying to erode their resistance through the endless repetition of explanation. She recognizes that some minds are like granite, beautiful in their own way, but fundamentally unsuited to receive the gift of her fluid nature. Rather than wearing herself away against their hardness, she learns to appreciate their solidity while seeking the more receptive landscapes where her waters can create gardens of understanding. The moon phases that govern her inner cycles become a source of power rather than apologetic explanation. She no longer feels compelled to justify her natural waxing and waning, her periods of luminous availability and mysterious withdrawal. Like the moon itself, she learns that her phases serve a cosmic purpose, that her times of fullness offer one kind of gift to the world, while her dark moon periods serve equally important functions in the invisible realm of regeneration and deep inner work. The seasonal wisdom that flows through her being teaches her that transformation is not a linear process, requiring constant documentation and explanation, but a cyclical journey of death and rebirth, dormancy and flowering, gathering and releasing. She understands that trying to explain these natural rhythms to those who live entirely on the surface of existence is like trying to describe the aurora borealis to someone who has never seen the night sky. Not impossible, perhaps, but ultimately futile when the experience itself is available to any who possess the patience to wait in darkness for the mystery to reveal itself. In reclaiming her right to mysterious departure, she discovers that her leaving itself becomes a form of teaching. Not the harsh lesson of punishment, but the gentle instruction that some gifts can only be appreciated in their absence. Some truths can only be understood in the space left behind by their withdrawal. Her departure without explanation becomes a koan, a spiritual puzzle that offers enlightenment to those willing to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, while remaining forever insoluble to those who approach mystery as a problem to be fixed rather than a revelation to be received. The dangerous feminine power that awakens within her is the power to remain unknowable, even in the midst of intimate connection, to share her depths without surrendering her mystery, to love completely while maintaining the essential privacy that keeps her soul intact. This is not the withholding of the defended heart, but the natural reserve of the truly deep well, water freely given to those who approach with clean vessels, but protected from contamination by those who would muddy its clarity with their own unconscious debris. She learns to distinguish between the authentic curiosity that seeks to know her in order to love her more fully, and the invasive demand for information that seeks to know her in order to control, manipulate, or simply satisfy the voyeuristic hunger of minds that consume mystery rather than commune with it. The former receives the gift of her gradually revealed depth, while the latter encounters the smooth surface that reflects back only their own projections and expectations. The ancient goddess archetypes that flow through her awakening consciousness: Artemis with her inviolable autonomy, Persephone with her seasonal disappearances, Inanna with her journeys to the underworld, Kali with her cosmic dances of destruction and creation, all teach her that the divine feminine has never been required to explain itself to those who lack the capacity for reverence. These archetypal energies move through her being like underground rivers, connecting her to sources of power that predate the patriarchal demand for feminine transparency and accountability. As she embodies this liberated feminine mystery, she discovers that her very presence becomes a catalyst for others' growth, not because she teaches or explains, but because her embodied mystery challenges others to develop the organs of perception necessary to appreciate depth, to cultivate the patience required for real understanding, to grow beyond the infantile demand for immediate gratification into the mature capacity for wonder and reverence. The ocean of her being learns to recognize which shores can receive the gift of her waves, and which are too rocky, too polluted, or too defended to allow her waters to nourish the land. She no longer crashes herself against every coastline in the desperate hope of being received, but learns to lavish her abundance on the beaches that welcome her caress, the estuaries that create perfect conditions for her nutrients to feed new life, the harbors that provide safe haven for the treasures she carries in her depths. Her silence becomes not the absence of communication, but the presence of a deeper form of expression, the wordless dialogue that occurs between souls who have learned to read the subtle languages of energy, emotion, and intuitive knowing. In this silence, more profound exchanges occur than ever happened in the realm of demanded explanation. Connections are forged that transcend the need for verbal confirmation. Understanding develops organically from the patient cultivation of receptivity rather than the forceful extraction of information. The liberation she experiences extends beyond her personal relationships into every area of her existence. In her creative work, she no longer feels compelled to explain her artistic choices to those who lack the sensitivity to receive them as they are offered. In her professional life, she learns to present her authentic self without the exhausting performance of making that self acceptable to every possible audience. In her spiritual journey, she claims the right to her own direct experience of the sacred without requiring validation from religious authorities who would prefer her divinity pre-packaged and domesticated. This reclaimed mystery transforms her relationship to time itself. No longer does she spend precious hours and days crafting explanations for those who have already decided what they want to believe about her. Instead, this time becomes available for the cultivation of her own depths, the development of her gifts, the patient nurturing of the seeds of possibility that can only germinate in the fertile silence of her own contemplation. The water-like feminine that flows through her consciousness teaches her about the power of persistence without force, of influence without domination, of transformation without violence. She learns that the most profound changes occur gradually, almost imperceptibly, through the constant gentle pressure of her authentic presence, rather than through dramatic confrontations or elaborate explanations. Like water wearing away stone, her sustained beingness accomplishes what no amount of argumentative erosion could achieve. In the depths of this liberation, she discovers that mystery is not something she possesses, but something she is. Not a strategy for maintaining interest, but the natural emanation of a soul that has learned to draw its sense of worth from interior sources rather than external validation. Her mystery is not performed but lived, not calculated but breathed, not defended but simply honored as the sacred space within which her truest self can flourish, without interference from those who would reduce her complexity to manageable simplicity. The ancient feminine that speaks through her awakened consciousness reminds her that women have always been the keepers of mystery, the midwives of birth and death, the healers who work with invisible forces, the seers who read signs and dreams and omens, the priestesses who commune with powers that resist rational explanation. This is her lineage, her inheritance, her birthright that no amount of cultural conditioning can permanently destroy. As she steps fully into this liberation, she becomes living proof that the highest form of communication is sometimes the wisdom to say nothing at all. Not because she lacks words, but because she possesses something infinitely more valuable than words: the embodied knowledge of her own worth, the lived understanding of her own depths, the unshakable conviction that those worthy of her mystery will approach it with reverence, while those who demand its violation have already revealed their fundamental unworthiness to receive the treasures hidden in the depths of her being. In this mysterious silence, she finds not isolation, but the deepest form of connection, the communion that occurs between souls who recognize the sacred in each other, who approach mystery as a doorway rather than a barrier, who understand that the most profound truths cannot be spoken, but must be lived, breathed, and embodied in the patient cultivation of a presence so authentic that it needs no explanation, so deep that it speaks for itself, so mysterious that it remains forever new to those who have learned to see with the eyes of wonder rather than the instruments of analysis. As this phase of her journey completes itself, she stands transformed, no longer the woman who felt compelled to explain herself into exhaustion, but the mysterious feminine who understands that her depths are her power, her silence is her sanctuary, and her right to departure without explanation is as natural and unquestionable as the ocean's right to its tides. She has remembered that the most profound feminine power has always been mysterious, cyclical, and ultimately uncontainable by the demands of those who would reduce her complexity to simple explanations they can understand and control. The ultimate revelation emerges like dawn breaking over the longest night of the soul, that moment when the horizon suddenly blazes with the recognition that her freedom has never needed to be earned through explanation, never required justification through words, never demanded validation through others' understanding. It arrives not as a gentle suggestion or hopeful possibility, but as an absolute truth that restructures the very foundation of her existence. She is inherently, unquestionably, irrevocably free, and this freedom is not contingent upon anyone else's comprehension or approval. Standing at this precipice of realization, she can look back across the vast landscape of her journey and see with crystal clarity how she had been living as a prisoner in a cell whose door was never actually locked. The bars that had contained her were woven from her own beliefs about what she owed others, what explanations were required, what justifications would earn her the right to exist as she chose. But now, in this moment of awakening, she understands that the prison was always an illusion, and the key to her freedom was never in anyone else's possession. It had been in her own hand all along. This recognition brings with it a quality of liberation so profound that it seems to alter the very air around her. She breathes differently now, moves differently, carries herself with the bearing of someone who has discovered a secret so transformative that it changes everything while changing nothing, because the freedom was always there, waiting to be claimed. What has changed is not her circumstances, but her understanding of her own sovereignty, her own right to exist without permission, her own authority to make choices without requiring external validation. The high-value woman who emerges from this recognition carries within herself something that the world finds simultaneously magnetic and threatening: the dangerous power of complete self-authorization. She has stepped beyond the need for approval, transcended the compulsion to explain, evolved past the requirement to justify her existence to those who never had the authority to question it in the first place. She moves through the world like a force of nature that needs no permission to be itself, no explanation for its power, no justification for its presence. This self-authorization manifests first as an inner knowing so deep and unshakable that it transforms her relationship with every external pressure, every demand for explanation, every attempt to make her accountable for choices that harm no one but may inconvenience those who had grown comfortable with her previous compliance. She recognizes these pressures now for what they have always been: not legitimate requests for understanding, but attempts to maintain control over someone who was never actually under their jurisdiction. The transformation ripples outward from this inner core like circles expanding infinitely across still water. In professional settings, she no longer feels compelled to over-explain her decisions or seek consensus for choices that fall within her domain of responsibility. She presents her conclusions with the quiet confidence of someone who has done her homework and trusts her own judgment, offering information when it serves the greater good, but never from a place of defensive justification. In romantic relationships, this self-authorization becomes particularly powerful. She stops performing elaborate explanations for her boundaries, her needs, her choices about how she spends her time and energy. A man worthy of her love, she understands, will respect her decisions because he respects her, not because she has successfully argued him into acceptance. Those who demand detailed justifications for her autonomy reveal themselves as unsuitable for the role they seek to play in her life. With family members, perhaps the most challenging arena for this transformation, she learns to love without capitulating, to maintain connection without sacrificing sovereignty. She stops participating in the familiar dynamics where her choices become group discussion topics requiring her defense. Her family learns to navigate this new version of her, one who loves them deeply but will not submit her life decisions to committee approval. The friendships that survive this transformation are those built on mutual respect rather than her willingness to explain herself into exhaustion. She discovers that true friends celebrate her growth rather than demanding that she justify it, support her choices rather than requiring detailed explanations for them. The friends who cannot adapt to her evolution naturally fall away, revealing that their attachment was to her compliance rather than her authentic self. This process of natural selection in relationships becomes one of the most valuable aspects of her transformation. By refusing to explain herself into others' comfort zones, she creates a filter that allows only those capable of respecting her sovereignty to remain in her inner circle. The quality of her connections improves dramatically as the quantity may decrease, leaving her surrounded by people who love her for who she is, rather than what she can be convinced to become. The high-value woman who walks away in silence understands something profound about the nature of departure itself. She has learned that the most powerful exits are often the quietest ones, that the most meaningful statements are sometimes made through absence rather than presence. Her silence becomes a form of communication, more eloquent than any speech, carrying within it all the words that need not be spoken, because the truth is already evident to those with eyes to see it. This silent departure is not the absence of communication, but its highest form, a message so clear and unambiguous that it requires no translation, no explanation, no justification. When she removes her presence from situations that diminish rather than enhance her spirit, she speaks volumes about her values, her self-worth, her unwillingness to participate in dynamics that require her to sacrifice her authenticity for others' comfort. She discovers that this type of departure often accomplishes what months of explanation never could. Her absence creates space for others to examine their own behavior without the distraction of defending against her words. It allows the truth of the situation to emerge organically rather than being obscured by the fog of argument and justification. Sometimes the greatest gift she can give to others is the opportunity to miss her presence, and in that missing, to understand what they have lost through their failure to value what they had. The mystery of her vanishing becomes a teacher in itself. Those who truly cared for her begin to examine their own actions, wondering what they might have done differently to preserve something precious that they now realize they took for granted. Those who never truly valued her reveal themselves through their indifference to her absence, confirming that her decision to leave was not only justified but necessary for her spiritual survival. This transformation brings with it a new relationship with time itself. She no longer feels pressured to provide immediate responses to demands for explanation, immediate justifications for her choices, immediate availability for others' emotional needs. She moves with the rhythm of her own inner seasons, responding when response serves her highest good, remaining silent when silence serves her sacred purpose, departing when departure honors her authentic truth. The high-value woman who has claimed her inexplicable freedom understands that her time is not communal property requiring democratic management, but sovereign territory that she governs according to her own wisdom. She stops apologizing for having priorities that don't align with others' preferences, stops explaining why she chooses to invest her energy in some areas rather than others, stops justifying her right to live according to her own values rather than others' expectations. This sovereignty over her own time and energy creates a natural hierarchy in her relationships, based not on favoritism or manipulation, but on the simple recognition that some connections nourish her soul while others drain it. Some interactions expand her possibilities while others contract them. Some people support her growth while others demand that she remain small to accommodate their limitations. She begins to understand that her energy is a finite resource that becomes more precious as she learns to value it appropriately. No longer does she scatter this energy like seeds, thrown randomly on any available ground. Instead, she becomes a careful gardener, choosing where to plant her attention, her time, her emotional investment based on what is most likely to flourish and contribute to the garden of her life. The freedom she has claimed brings with it a new understanding of love itself. She recognizes that true love does not require the beloved to explain themselves into acceptability, does not demand justification for their authentic nature, does not insist on detailed maps of their inner territory as the price of affection. Real love trusts, accepts, allows space for mystery and growth, celebrates the beloved's autonomy rather than seeking to constrain it through demands for explanation. This understanding revolutionizes her capacity for both giving and receiving love. She stops trying to love people into understanding her and instead offers her love as a gift without strings attached. They can accept it as it is or leave it, but she will not diminish it through desperate attempts to make it more palatable. Similarly, she begins to recognize and reject pseudo-love that comes with conditions requiring her to explain or justify her authentic self. The inexplicable freedom she has claimed becomes a beacon for others who are still trapped in the prison of over-explanation. They sense in her presence something they long for but may not yet understand. The possibility of existing without apology, of making choices without requiring committee approval, of living authentically without constantly defending their right to do so. Some are inspired by her example to begin their own journey towards sovereign selfhood. Others are threatened by her freedom and attempt to shame her back into the familiar cage of justification. She learns to hold space for both reactions without taking responsibility for either. Her freedom is not a judgment on those who have not yet claimed their own, nor is it a gift she can bestow upon others through explanation or example. Each person must walk their own path toward liberation, must claim their own right to exist without apology, must learn in their own way that freedom is an inherent birthright rather than an earned privilege. The grace that emerges from this inexplicable freedom is perhaps the most beautiful aspect of her transformation. She moves through the world with a lightness that comes from no longer carrying the weight of others' expectations, a peace that comes from no longer fighting battles that were never hers to win, a joy that springs from the simple recognition that she is free to be herself without requiring anyone else's permission or understanding. This grace is not the artificial sweetness of someone trying to be liked, nor the performative kindness of someone seeking approval. It is the natural radiance of a woman who has come home to herself, who has claimed her birthright of authentic existence, who has learned that the highest form of service to others is often the courage to live as her truest self, regardless of their comfort with that truth. As this final chapter of transformation reaches its culmination, she stands complete, not in the sense of having no further growth ahead of her, but in the profound recognition that she needs nothing outside herself to validate her worth, justify her choices, or authorize her existence. The high-value woman who has claimed her inexplicable freedom carries within herself the dangerous and beautiful power of complete self-possession, the revolutionary understanding that she owes no one explanations for living authentically, and the liberating truth that her freedom to choose her own path is as natural and unquestionable as her freedom to breathe. In her silence, she speaks volumes. In her departure, she teaches profound lessons. In her refusal to explain, she demonstrates the highest form of self-respect. She has become living proof that the most profound transformations happen not when we finally convince others of our worth, but when we finally stop trying to, trusting instead in the inexplicable grace of our own inherent freedom to exist, to choose, to love, and to leave according to the mysterious wisdom of our own authentic truth.